Coast Guard to communicate to Congress early and often on what your needs are in this process on your plans to ensure this work can finish uninterrupted, and to do so in a partnership with the legislative branch. Beyond the immediate response, I look forward to hearing from the Federal Highway Administrator, Bhatt, about the timeline to replace the bridge and the role the federal government is playing in aiding that process. Congress established the Emergency Relief Program in 1958 as part of the Federal Highway Program to provide for the reconstruction of highways and bridges in the event of a disaster. Congress understood that a state could not be expected to cover the costs of an unforeseen emergency loss of infrastructure out of its annual road budget. That's still true today. Maryland transportation officials estimate it will cost up to $1.9 billion to replace the bridge. Frankly, there's a lot of estimates out there, and it's a broad range, so I really wouldn't call them estimates at this point, frankly. So while US DOT has provided $60 million in ER funds to date, we do know that's a fraction of the total need. Prior to collapse, the Key Bridge carried 34,000 vehicles a day. Traffic diversion is increasing vehicle crossings in the Fort McHenry and Harbor tunnels by 18%. And truck drivers carrying hazardous materials currently must add 25 miles to get through Baltimore via alternate routes, including communities that did not expect hazmat trucks to be going through them. This committee has a role to help rebuild this critical economic artery quickly and efficiently, including ensuring the project can advance without a cost share from Maryland. Finally, I want to welcome back Committee Chair Homendy, and congratulations on your reconfirmation last night. The NTSB's thorough investigation of this catastrophe will help answer questions about how to prevent future elisions, shore up bridges, save lives, and protect our critical infrastructure. I look forward to what Chair Homendy is able to share about this incident based on the NTSB's preliminary findings, which was released yesterday afternoon, I believe. So thank you to each of our witnesses. I want to thank the Chair for calling this hearing today, and look forward to what you all have to say. With that, I yield back.
So I'd ask unanimous consent that the witnesses' full statements be included in the record, and without objection, that is so ordered. I'd ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing, and without objection, that is also so ordered. I'd also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing, and without objection, that is so ordered. So your written testimony has obviously been included in the record, so the committee asks that you try to limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. And with that, Vice Admiral Gautier, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, distinguished members of the committee. Good morning. Thank you, first off, for your kind words about the Coast Guard in your opening remarks, and I appreciate the opportunity to testify before the committee. In the early hours of March 26, the container ship Dali struck and collapsed the Francis Scott Key Bridge. 6 individuals lost their lives. Baltimore lost a landmark part of its skyline, and the region suffered a blockage of a crucial waterway. We continue to honor the memory of those victims. Today, at the 51-day point, over 6,000 tons of steel and concrete have been removed from the wreckage field. Access has been restored to the Port of Baltimore, with more than 35 large commercial vessels sailing through a limited access channel, and 375 additional commercial and recreational vessels have used 3 shallower temporary access channels, the first of which was established just 6 days after the bridge collapse. The hazardous materials aboard the motor vessel Dali were stabilized, as was the ship itself. And I'll report today that Unified Command believes that the Dali will be able to be refloated and removed from that site early next week is what they're looking at. Particularly notable, countless complex steps in this operation have been completed without a single worker injury. These monumental efforts were made possible through the exemplary unity of effort of the Unified Command, rapid mobilization of personnel and resources, strong coordination, and trusted partnerships. The Unified Command formed within the first few hours per the National Response Framework, our national doctrine for response to disasters and emergencies. The Coast Guard, Army Corps of Engineers, Maryland State Police, Maryland Transportation Authority, Maryland Department of the Environment, and Witt O'Brien's, which represented the owners and operators of the Dali, have effectively leveraged each other's jurisdictions, authorities, and capabilities to get us where we are today. The Coast Guard is proud to be part of this response. Our women and men serve on the front lines of a nation whose economic prosperity and national security are inexorably linked to our maritime transportation system. We exercise 6 of our 11 statutory missions in this response, from the early hours of the search and rescue response to restoring vessel traffic by setting aids to navigation. The Coast Guard's broad authorities position the service to coordinate activities to assure the safety, security, and stewardship of our waterways, but we're also successful through partnerships and continuously exercising, operating, and coordinating with federal, state, and local industry partners. And one prime example, Chairman, you mentioned, is the fantastic work on the quick notification by the pilots to the MTA dispatch, which inevitably saved countless numbers of lives. But the work is not done. The Unified Command remains sharply focused on the full restoration of the MTS. Active investigations continue in parallel with the response, including the Coast Guard's Marine Board of Investigation, our highest level of marine casualty investigation, to determine the incident's causal factors and support the development of preventative recommendations. Our investigation is in cooperation with the NTSB, which has taken the lead on the safety investigation, and the Coast Guard investigation is also moving concurrently and separately from the Department of Justice's criminal investigation. While we look forward to the results of these investigations, it is evident, looking more broadly, that the size and complexity of ships has grown over the years, placing greater demands on our marine transportation infrastructure that may not have kept pace with the increased risks that these vessels pose. It's time for us to more broadly understand these risks. So, as Deputy Commandant for Operations, I will be convening a nationwide board of inquiry under Title 46 U.S. Code, led by my Assistant Commandant for Prevention Policy, Rear Admiral Wayne Arguin. The purpose will be to assess the efficacy of the Coast Guard's suite of risk management tools, evaluate how recently they've been used within major ports, and establish a holistic national-level approach to develop risk profiles, identify ways to address vulnerabilities, and propose actions to reduce the risk of major incidents. This Board of Inquiry is a necessary step to bolster our MTS resiliency and assure the safe and secure and efficient flow of commerce on our waterways. Coast Guard's ready to lead this effort. Thank you for this opportunity and for your enduring support of the Coast Guard, and I look forward to your questions.
Next, we have Major General Graham. Thanks for being here. Recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today to discuss the emergency response by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge. On behalf of the Corps, please allow me to begin today by offering our heartfelt condolences to the families of the 6 individuals lost to this tragedy. From the outset, we were committed to supporting the efforts to recover their loved ones. Our thoughts and prayers continue to be with them. Soon after this tragic event occurred, Maryland Governor Wes Moore declared a state of emergency, and the Corps' Baltimore District Commander, Colonel S.D. Pinchason, activated the district's Emergency Operations Center. Our state-of-the-art survey vessels, which usually serve to verify the depth and width of the federal channels, were deployed to support the initial search and rescue dive operations. Our support then evolved as the Army Corps joined a multi-agency effort across all levels of government to form a unified command. I've been in a good many disaster responses over the years, and this unified command team, led by Coast Guard Captain David O'Connell, is one of the best I've ever seen. The guidance from the President was clear from the beginning. Clearing the wreckage from the federal channel was the Army Corps' top priority. We needed 3 things to immediately execute this mission: authority, current funding, and the right contracting capacity. Authority. We used the authority for the Baltimore Harbor and Channels project. Congress authorized the Army Corps to construct and maintain a 50-foot deep channel. That channel was now fully blocked by the wreckage of the Key Bridge. Funding. We initially used available FY23 and FY24 funding for that Baltimore Harbor and Channel project. Additional funds, as discussed earlier by Ranking Member Larson, have been provided through internal emergency reprogramming actions using aged, unused funding just from Harbor Maintenance and Trust Fund projects. The Army Corps has not used this emergency reprogramming authority at this scale for over 15 years. The third thing we needed was contracting capacity. The Army Corps has a standard interagency agreement with the Navy's Supervisor of Salvage and Diving. Led by Captain Sal Suarez and Director Paul Hankins, SupSalv are true world-class professionals. They have a suite of contracting tools that give us access to superb salvage companies. In this case, the contractor they're using is Don John Marine from Newark, New Jersey. The Army Corps turns to Navy SupSalv often to leverage their unique expertise. I last worked with SupSalv in 2022 during Hurricane Ian response in Central Florida. Navy SupSalv helped us pump the upper Kissimmee River backwards for a few days, saving around 12,000 homes south of Orlando from flooding. They're true professionals who know how to deliver outstanding results. With these three elements in place, we embarked on the complex task of determining how to begin clearing the approximately 50,000 tons of concrete, asphalt, and steel from Patapsco River. For context, that's over 200 Statues of Liberty worth of material. After conducting extensive engineering analysis, the Army Corps, in collaboration with our partners, developed an ambitious but feasible timeline. Our plan was to initially clear a 35-foot deep limited access channel by the end of April and restore the full 50-foot federal navigation channel by the end of May. Certified by the Coast Guard, the limited access channel was open to one-way vehicle traffic on April 25th, a week ahead of schedule. This channel could support approximately 70% of the port traffic, particularly the car carriers that are so important to Baltimore. To open up the full channel, we first had to execute the most difficult task, that of removing a section of bridge that had collapsed onto the bow of the Dali. I'm delighted to report that on Monday of this week, the team successfully used precision demolitions to cut the bridge away from the ship. Today, operations continue to remove the Dali from the southern edge of the federal channel. This will facilitate the removal of the remaining bridge wreckage from the river. We remain on track to open the full 700-foot wide by 50-foot deep federal channel by the end of May. In closing, we're tremendously proud to be part of this stellar unified team who was mentioned earlier, safely removing the bridge wreckage from the federal channel, allowing the Port of Baltimore to resume its role as a key supply chain node and vital economic engine. Thank you, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the committee, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Next, Administrator Bhatt, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. The collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge on March 26th was a tragic event for Baltimore, Maryland, and the entire nation. While the collapse of the bridge itself was shocking, we must not lose sight of the devastating impact this tragedy has had on the victims and their families. The 6 victims were fathers, husbands, and friends in their homes and communities, and they were valued members of the construction workforce. We will always mourn these 6 individuals who lost their lives while working to strengthen our transportation system. I also want to thank the emergency responders who acted quickly to save lives. I have had the opportunity to visit the site of the bridge collapse, and while I have been engaged in a number of bridge-related incidents during my career, I have never seen anything at this scale. It is a monumental task to clean up the site and rebuild. And yet, as I appear before the committee today, I have a great feeling of optimism, witnessing the ability of industry and government entities to work together in times of calamity, as they have done in the weeks since the bridge collapse. Immediately following this catastrophic event, the Federal Highway Administration mobilized internally across multiple offices and externally with local, state, and federal partners to support the response. President Biden has been clear in this administration's commitment to reconstruct the bridge. Under Secretary Buttigieg's leadership, FHWA is actively coordinating with other operating administrations and offices within the United States Department of Transportation, the Maryland Department of Transportation, which includes the Maryland Transportation Authority and State Highway Administration, the City of Baltimore, U.S. Coast Guard, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and others to mitigate supply chain impacts, manage traffic, reopen the port, and ultimately reconstruct the bridge. FHWA is actively supporting the National Transportation Safety Board's investigation of the collapse. FHWA has been in direct communication with MDOT, Maryland DOT, regarding all possible options for reconstructing the bridge, and is committed to supporting these efforts so that the bridge can be reconstructed as quickly and safely as possible. It is critical that we reconstruct this vital connection for people and goods traveling along the East Coast. Ensuring that the I-695 corridor is open, operational, and safe for the traveling public at the earliest possible moment is a top priority. On March 28th, within hours of receiving the request for funding assistance from Maryland DOT, FHWA announced the immediate availability of $60 million in quick release emergency relief funds. These funds serve as a down payment towards initial costs, and additional emergency relief program funding will be made available as work continues. The administration is asking Congress to join it in demonstrating a commitment to aid in recovery efforts by authorizing a 100% federal cost share for rebuilding the bridge, consistent with past catastrophic bridge collapses. FHWA continues to provide wide-ranging technical assistance to Maryland DOT regarding contract procurement for debris removal, procurement for reconstruction operations, and project delivery strategies to reconstruct the bridge quickly and safely. FHWA also is working with Maryland DOT to ensure that the new bridge will be built to current design standards and in accordance with all applicable federal laws. On March 26, 2024, the day of the collapse, FHWA met with the National Transportation Liaisons from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Coast Guard, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and the EPA to discuss each agency's respective emergency procedures and considerations to expedite the environmental review and permitting processes for the future reconstruction. FHWA continues to meet with federal resource agencies to discuss permitting. Thank you to the state, local, and federal entities who continue to collaborate in response to this tragic event, whether it is an event of this scale and complexity or the comparatively smaller but still impactful bridge incidents on I-95 in Philadelphia and on I-10 in Los Angeles. I am proud to lead an agency that is playing a part in showing the country what can happen when the government and industry come together with a common goal. There are no democratic roads or Republican bridges. Transportation truly unites us. FHWA will continue to do everything it can to support the response. As the President has said, we will not rest until the cement has dried on the entirety of the new bridge. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks. Now we'll go to Chair Homendy.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the committee. With me today is our lead investigator on this accident, Marcel Muse, our acting director of Marine Safety, Eric Stolzenberg, and other dedicated NTSB staff. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss our ongoing investigation into the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge. On behalf of the NTSB, I offer our heartfelt condolences to the families of all those who were lost in this tragedy, and our deepest sympathies to those who were injured or otherwise impacted by this event. I also want to thank our numerous federal and state partners for their support on scene and throughout this investigation. Yesterday, we released our preliminary report, which shows that the Dali experienced 4 total power outages. Preliminary information indicates that the March 25th blackouts were mechanically distinct from those that occurred on March 26th. 2 were related to routine maintenance in port. 2 were unexpected tripping of circuit breakers on the accident voyage. On the 25th, a blackout occurred when a crew member mistakenly closed an engine damper while he was working on the exhaust system in port. This effectively blocked the engine's exhaust gases from traveling out of the vessel's stack, causing the engine to stall. Vessel power was briefly restored, but insufficient fuel pressure to the online generator caused its speed to decrease. Its breaker opened, and a second blackout occurred. While recovering from this second blackout, the crew switched to a different transformer and set of breakers from those that had been in use for several months. Switching breakers is not unusual, but may have affected operations the very next day on the accident voyage. So the configuration of the breakers remains under investigation. On the 26th, when the ship was about 0.6 miles from the bridge, 1 high voltage and 1 low voltage breaker that were powering most of the vessel's equipment and lighting unexpectedly tripped. As a result, the vessel lost main propulsion. Bridge equipment also lost power, and the voyage data recorder lost system feeds. Bridge audio continued to be recorded. The crew was able to briefly restore power to the vessel, but another blackout occurred when a different breaker tripped. At this point, the ship was about 0.2 miles from the Key Bridge. The crew regained electrical power right before the Dali struck Pier 17, but they were unable to restore propulsion. The ship had an emergency generator, which automatically started following the first blackout on the 26th. However, the generator only powers systems like emergency lighting, navigation, radio equipment, alarms, and a steering pump that allowed for low-speed, limited rudder movements. It does not power propulsion, and without the propeller turning, the rudder was less effective. They were essentially drifting. We're still investigating the exact time the emergency generator started. Going forward, this is a complex investigation. Our investigators have been on scene consistently since this accident. In fact, they are on board the vessel as I testify today. It is unprecedented to be there that long. We will continue evaluating the design and operation of the Dali's power distribution system, including its breakers. Examination of damage to the vessel will continue when the ship is clear of debris and moved to a shoreside facility. We're also working with Maryland as they assess pier protection on their other bridges. And we're examining pier protection improvements that have been made following other bridge collapses resulting from marine vessel strikes that we have investigated in the past. Lastly, there are a lot of questions regarding the fuel. Our investigators found that the ship was running on low-sulfur marine gas oil at the time of the accident, which it had been using since March 21st. We directed an independent lab to test all fuel stored on the ship, including the fuel that was being burned at the time of the accident. The test results did not identify any concerns related to the quality of the fuel. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you all, and now we'll turn to questions, and I'll let Rick answer the first one.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. First question's for Administrator Bhatt. You said that when you look at reconstruction of the bridge, you'll look at current standards consistent with law. Does the current law allow, in this a circumstance like this, a rebuild of a different kind of bridge in order to be eligible for either federal or for the cost share? Because you could build one under current standards, and that could be in violation of what the law under this circumstance allows you to do. So can you walk through that a little bit?
Thank you for the question, sir. Yeah, I think what we're examining and working with Maryland DOT on, the original bridge was built in the 1970s, a truss bridge, which was common at the time. Today, most of the bridges that are being replaced that are truss bridges are being replaced by cable stay bridges. Different standards. Obviously, we're going to want to hear from the NTSB on their final results of that investigation. But under the law, what we want to do is when we're replacing a structure of that size, we want to build it to current standards, and Maryland DOT will be allowed to do that. What we want to make sure we're not doing is allowing for any quote-unquote betterments that did not exist that would be then covered by the ER program.
Yeah, okay. Admiral Gautier, the Corps has expended significant resources in the recovery effort. There's no mechanism for the Coast Guard has. There's no mechanism for the Coast Guard to recoup that funding, and you're not typically reimbursed for this kind of work. Yet, with a workforce shortage of about 10%, you're downgrading stations within the Coast Guard, not because of this incident, but that's just what's happening in the Coast Guard. We passed a Coast Guard authorization that gets us to $14.5 billion for 25 and $15 billion for 26. So we're not near the goal of a $20 billion service for 2030. So just as Congress moves forward with supplemental appropriations for the Key Bridge, how is the Coast Guard thinking about being part of that supplemental appropriation to get reimbursed for get some cost recovery for your work?
Yeah, thanks, Ranking Member. And I don't want to get ahead of the administration on the plans or the amounts and so on, the details of the supplemental. But the way you've articulated, first of all, we have been expending operating funds as we do during emergencies like this, like we do for hurricane responses and other things. And we've been keeping close tabs on those. And so far, we've spent about $20 million of direct and indirect funding on this particular response. But what we see in events like this and others like it is that we do what we call burn readiness, right? So we have to have other assets around the area work harder and to cover for the boats, aircraft, people who are working these. We've mobilized now, when I visited the command post, on average, we've had about 200 individuals at the peak in the command post per day. That's gone down. We're mobilizing them from around the country. In fact, most of them are from outside Baltimore right now, and so there's an opportunity cost from the commands that provide those individuals. And I think what this exposes, sir, and you know us well, is that the Coast Guard readiness is becoming more and more brittle as we fail to have the kind of consistent budgets reaching that $20 billion a year that the Coast Guard's articulated, reaching the $3 billion per year on our procurement, construction, and improvement, double what we actually receive in order to do the necessary capitalizations. And so this brittleness in our readiness manifests in a whole bunch of different ways, and we really do appreciate congressional support and ask for additional support for appropriations in the future.
Yeah, thanks. General Graham, now to you, kind of the same question, but last week the Corps reprogrammed $20 million in unused funds from FY 2020, including $1 million out of my district, and from prior year funds. Do you have an estimate how many more dollars you might need to reprogram, first? And second, how are you thinking about a supplemental appropriation for cost recovery for the Corps?
Ranking Member Larson, thank you for that question. Similar to the Coast Guard, we certainly want to get ahead of the administration, but right now we've been able to use the project funds, and as your opening statement indicated, that dredging work that we had planned to do with those funds in this year will still need to be done. The emergency reprogramming that I referenced in my opening statement, most of that money we didn't need. So where does that money come from? Mainly it's bid savings. A lot of these projects had happened during times of COVID when it was a very favorable bid environment, and we were able to go back to those funds. A good example of what some of that might be, a contractor might put a claim on a project, a request for equitable adjustment, and a few years later, those claims have been adjudicated, and if we didn't have to pay that request, then we would unobligate those funds.
Mr. Chairman, if I could indulge me for a moment, not for a question, but I do want to let Chair Homendy know I'll need to absorb your first half of your report. It's rather technical. I'm not an engineer, but we'll absorb it and get back to you with some questions on it. And just as a data point for the committee, the Skagit River Bridge collapse in 2013 cost a total of $19 million for the insurer and took us 10 years to recover $19 million. So we should not be thinking of waiting to recover costs from insurance, the insurer of the carrier or the bridge or whatever, in order to pay for it. It's going to have to take place first because it took 10 years to get $19 million. If that's the average time it gets $19 million, we'll all be dead by the time we get the money back from this ocean carrier. So just a point, just a data point for folks. Thanks.
Mr. Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony today. I want to start by acknowledging the 6 workers who lost their lives as a result of the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge. Obviously, our deepest sympathies go out to their families and their loved ones. Hours after the Francis Scott Key Bridge tragically collapsed, President Biden came out and said it was his, quote, intention that the federal government will pay for the entire cost of reconstructing that bridge. And further, he had, quote, directed his team to move heaven and earth to reopen the port and rebuild the bridge as soon as humanly possible. Administrator Bhatt, I have a series of questions here as we try to understand the mechanics of the situation before us. And if you would, just give me a yes or no response in the interest of time. While the bridge was located on I-695 prior to its collapse, it wasn't actually considered a part of the interstate, but rather was Maryland State Route 695. Is that correct?
Yes.
the bridge had previously never received any federal funding. Is that correct?
Yes.
I understand that Federal Highways has since approved a request by Maryland to designate the bridge as interstate. Is that correct?
Yes.
Meaning the federal share for reconstruction under the Emergency Relief Program will now be 90%. Is that correct?
Yes, instead of 80.
Okay. So what we're talking about here is a delta of 10% for a bridge that previously never received any federal funding.
Yes.
Okay. In your testimony, you mentioned that authorizing a 100% federal cost share would be consistent with past catastrophic bridge collapses. How many times has Congress authorized a 100% federal share for a fully collapsed bridge?
I think the reference point we're using is the I-35W collapse in Minnesota.
Okay. Some say that we need 100% federal funding so we can get the rebuilding done quickly, but that's not how the ER program works. It's a reimbursement program, correct?
Absolutely.
As I understand the ER financing process, generally individual states, the division offices, and the program office have a process to make sure that projects are ready to receive funding and work can be completed in a specified time period. Is that right?
Yes.
So it doesn't really matter if a project is getting 80% federal share, 90%, or even 100%. The reimbursement is based on project progress and delivery, correct?
Yes.
I just want to be clear that nothing is going to move faster if this is 100% federal funded versus 90% or any other percentage. Whether the state contributes money or not, the process for awarding federal reimbursement is still the same, correct?
Can I just deviate from the yes/no for a second?
Go ahead.
Yes. However, the 10%, so this is the second largest ER request we've ever received, $2.2 billion for Katrina was the first one, so $1.7 to $1.9 billion. So that 10% delta is about $170 to $190 million for the state of Maryland that, as they're programming out their multi-year, multi-billion-dollar program, it may not be this project, but it may have impacts on other projects.
Okay, let me just briefly, in the time that I have left, let's talk about the regulatory regime that will be applied here. Are we going to expect any kind of waivers or anything like that on NEPA or any other regulatory compliance measures that would be customary on any other construction project?
So, sir, we would not waive NEPA or any of the environmental requirements, but what we have done is coordinated with our agencies who issue permits, and it is our intention, because the bridge previously existed in this relative footprint, that it would be likely a categorical exclusion, which would minimize the time.
Expand on categorical exclusion. What does that mean?
When you go through NEPA, you can either do like a full environmental impact statement. We could get to a finding of no significant impact on environmental assessment. Categorical exclusion is sort of the more time-limited finding, and what is the reason we would use that basis here is because the bridge previously existed, and we're putting a bridge back relatively in the same footprint.
You're putting it back in the same spot, but not necessarily, because you're probably going to use different kind of construction. Would there be some associated flow studies, for example, to address the new construction?
So that is why we are coordinating with our sister agencies who issue the permit, because it is, as I said, relatively in that same footprint, but probably going to use different piers. It's probably going to have a little bit of tweaking to the approaches, a different height than was there before. So that's why I can't say definitively that'll be a categorical exclusion. It's what we're working towards.
So it sounds to me like there's going to be a great deal of flexibility in the interest of getting this thing restored, rebuilt, and restoring traffic and commerce and everything associated with that bridge. Is that correct?
I'm not sure if flexibility is the right word. I think attention from the sister agencies and understanding that there is a desire to move quickly. And
I'm all for that, and I hope that in the future that other projects are given the same consideration because time is money, and understand that that's certainly the case here, but there are a lot of other projects out there pending that have cost millions in regulatory compliance fees that have really been delayed as a result. So thank you, and I yield back.
Yes, sir.
Jordan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Bhatt, Department of Transportation data show that traffic crashes rose 29% on alternative routes in the weeks following the Key Bridge collapse. The same data show that it now takes between 2 and 4 times longer for drivers to travel those alternative routes. That traffic means trucks are delayed in reaching their destinations, commuters are late getting to their jobs or home to their families, and there is more air pollution and wasted fuel. How has the loss of the Key Bridge hurt traffic safety and reduced mobility for drivers in the Baltimore region?
Thank you for the question. I think, we saw in Philadelphia after I-95, we had that bridge collapse, that there was just all kinds of traffic moving through neighborhoods and trying to find their way. And I think a similar effect is happening in Baltimore. Usually when you have an impact where you remove a significant piece of infrastructure, traffic seems to level out after a while. That's not happening here in Baltimore to the same extent. And I think it's because of just the criticality of this artery. It's part of the Northeast Corridor. It's important for Maryland. It's important for Baltimore, but it's also important for the Northeast Corridor. And so, yes, there are trucks and vehicles moving through neighborhoods that they would not normally be on, and that's why it's so critically important that we move with as much speed as possible.
Administrator Bhatt, it is clear that we need to restore commerce to the Port of Baltimore and rebuild the bridge to improve safety and mobility in the region. The full Maryland delegation has proposed legislation to provide 100% federal share for the cost of the new bridge. I wholeheartedly support this legislation. What effect would the 100% federal share have on efforts to rebuild the bridge quickly?
Thank you, Representative, for the question. I've spent a lot of time running state DOTs in my career. I've been on the private side, so I was with AECOM before this job that works on bridges across the globe. And I would just say what the benefit of the 100% share brings is just it removes an element of uncertainty. So right now, I think Maryland, and I have to commend Maryland DOT, just really been consummate professionals throughout this process. Right now, what they're contemplating is an ER shortage that we have told them about, that we have $3.7 billion in unmet needs as the Federal Highway Administration, with about $870 million available for nationwide ER efforts. And so we're telling them we believe that we'll have the ER funding there for you. And then they have the uncertainty of the 90% versus the 100%. We did remove the 80% uncertainty. And so as you're planning out these multi-year, multi-billion-dollar construction programs, not knowing whether or not that $170 million is going to be there, does it impact things right now at this moment? No, they're going to move forward. But as they're projecting out and as they're trying to build their construction program, other contractors, it's an element of uncertainty that would be helpful. And just to clarify on the 100%, obviously any insurance payments, as the ranking member had mentioned, would be reapplied. So I can pretty much with certainty guarantee this will not be 100% federally funded eventually, because we will recoup all of the insurance payments as possible, and they will go back into the ER funds. But as the ranking member mentioned, we don't want to wait through all of the litigation and the NTSB investigations, insurance issues for that.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for putting this together. It's very informative. Thank you, witnesses. Last week, the Army Corps notified congressional offices that they would be utilizing the Emergency Reprogramming Authority to the program to reprogram approximately $33 million of previously appropriated operation and maintenance, harbor maintenance trust fund dollars for recovery costs imposed by the collapse of the Key Bridge. Nearly $1 million was reappropriated from Florida and projects in Florida without any request for input from congressional delegation, the state, or the people. While the recovery effort in Baltimore is important. This reprogramming of funds represents a blatant disregard for Florida and desperately needed improvements to our water resources and infrastructure. General Graham, if these recently reprogrammed funds were deemed to be in excess, why did the Corps let these funds sit for years and not act sooner to reprogram them towards projects locally in Florida? And will the Corps plan to reimburse the South Atlantic Division for these funds?
Congressman Webster, thank you for that question. The example I used earlier of some of the funds that we had set aside for when a contractor put a claim, that was from Jacksonville, and that was from the Jacksonville District, and it was Jacksonville Harbor. So in this case, those funds, I think $300-some thousand, are no longer needed for the Jacksonville Harbor project. So those funds in particular that we had set them aside for a need and that need didn't materialize, we will not seek recoupment for those. We did do this work, this emergency reprogramming work, Congressman, very rapidly. Right? And we, as I stated in my opening statement, we haven't used this authority at this scale for 15 years. And we are a little clunky at it in terms of our notification to you and your staffs. And I'll use Jacksonville District as an example, if there are some of those funds that they do find a need for, we'll figure out a way to make sure that the projects continue. To your first comment on some of those old funds that have been sitting out there for a while, why haven't we cleaned up the books sooner? Sir, you're absolutely right. We should have.
As you know better than most, that the Gulf states fought against the National Contingency Plan Unified Command Structure response throughout the Deep Horizon oil spill. The National Incident Commander's report concluded the state's efforts resulted in the political and social nullification of the oil spill response doctrine and structure and governance. It appears that the press reports that meetings with Maryland state officials and a number of staff member trips to the wreck site, that Maryland embraced the National Incident Command structure and then has worked well within that structure. Is the National Incident Command structure still an effective and efficient mechanism for coordinating federal interagency and state, local, federal interactions during the incidents such as the Dali?
Congressman, if that's for me, I can't agree more with your statement. As the Chief of Staff for Admiral Allen on the Deepwater Horizon spill, and now being someone who has been witness to the terrific work in the unified effort in this one, it's been very, very different in terms of cooperation and collaboration. Underpinning that is the absolute necessity and the benefit of the incident command system under the National Incident Management System framework. That has served this response incredibly well. It's the doctrine of the U.S. Any agency, entity, Army Corps, state can come together with a common lexicon, a common way of planning to come together and make this work. But I'd also like to highlight a real difference that has made a difference, and that is that elected leadership and the operational leadership has been connected in a very constructive way. From Governor Moore to Mayor Scott to members of Congress from the Maryland delegation, they have taken it upon themselves to get regular updates and a great interest in the progress in the response. They have handled for the Unified Command a lot of the public affairs and external communications in a very constructive way. And they've actually provided the trade space for the operational response to continue on without pressure, without being rushed. It's been very constructive.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson, for holding this important hearing on the federal response to the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse in Maryland. Further extend my condolences to the families of the 6 individuals who lost their lives during the collapse. Thank our esteemed witnesses for appearing here today, especially Administrator Bhatt, who was with us in Memphis on Monday. Appreciate your coming to see the I-55 bridge and the urgent need to replace it across the Mississippi River in Memphis and West Memphis. That is, of course, as you well know, a national treasure to have transportation going across the country there at I-40. We had the I-40 bridge have a problem last year and shut down. I-55 bridge could have the same problem, because it's in the New Madrid earthquake fault zone, which is predicted to occur. It's been predicted for about 20 years, but it's going to occur, and it's more likely sooner than later. As y'all look at the damages to the Key Bridge, which were caused partially, I think, because it wasn't built to withstand that large of a boat, and it could have been maybe the piers could have been buttressed and made it more stable. Is that correct? Mr. Bhatt, can you answer?
Thank you, Representative Cohen, and yes, it was good to spend some time with you in Memphis looking at that bridge. I think one of the things we're waiting for, and it was great to see the preliminary report from the NTSB, but I think we're going to be working closely with the NTSB just to figure out exactly what types of protection might be needed for bridges and what could have been possible, but again, I don't want to step into the NTSB realm.
I'm sorry. Please.
Thank you, sir. For the Key Bridge, we are obviously looking at, there were 2 dolphins on the east side, 2 on the west side. They're rather small, and the vessel just sort of bypassed the dolphins. What ended up striking the pier was the starboard side of the bow that hit the column. The pier protection around the column itself is timber, concrete, a little bit of steel, but it's very close into the pier itself. Other structures that we're looking at have pier protection that comes out farther so that a vessel can't get to the column. Other dolphins are much larger, so we are looking at other structures across the United States to see what might be good models. I think the key here is you have a bridge that was opened in 1977, and over time, it's not the bridge that's getting larger, it's not the waterway that's getting larger, it's the vessels that are getting larger, and not just width, but height. With containers. And so it's important that states and other bridge owners are looking at, from a risk assessment standpoint, what is now going through, what is the vessel traffic, and how is our infrastructure protected.
So were the bridges built after 1977 that were built in a fashion that they would have been able to withstand such an impact?
You have to, yeah.
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. It's an important question. We are working with our state DOT partners to identify all of the bridges that are subject to, seagoing vessels, also, in the Great Lakes region, barge traffic on the Mississippi and other waterways. I think what this bridge incident has done is driven home that need to look at many of our bridges, which are older, and look at that protection, and we're going to rely on the NTSB recommendations. Again, there was a lot of force. I've heard different, analogies of the force, the equivalent of a rocket ship taking off, and so we just want to be careful in our consideration of how we both protect and build bridges in the 21st century as they're dealing with these new potential threats.
Thank you. I just would like to urge you, as I did in Memphis, that we need to look at preventative measures so we don't have another Francis Scott Key Bridge disaster. And earthquakes would cause that. And there's no place in the United States, I think, more vulnerable than the New Madrid Fault and the I-55 bridge that was built before there were seismic standards that were not part of the bridge. So it's deficient, needs to be replaced, and hope that you'll look in terms, just as this disaster, at the bridges that we fund under the bipartisan infrastructure bill be ones that might be susceptible to either earth, God created, I hate to say God, I hate to give God responsibility, but the disasters that are caused by other than man-made disasters. I yield back, and I thank you for coming, and Elvis thanks you too.
Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll begin by just offering my condolences to the family, and I think it underscores, the circumstance underscores how potentially horrific, almost unimaginable, what might be seen as mundane work can end up being at a critical moment. It is unimaginable. If you can imagine yourself at 2 or 3 in the morning falling, 100, 200 feet into the water, steel and concrete crashing around you. With that, Administrator Bhatt, the Francis Scott Key Bridge is was a toll facility that never received any federal funding prior to the collapse, right?
Yes, sir.
And how much revenue did the state of Maryland receive or generate from the bridge on an annual basis, if you know?
Sir, I'd have to double check. I don't want to give you a false number.
Okay,
I'll come back to you on that.
I didn't know if you would have a different figure than I do. I've got about $56.8 million in 2023, just for your reference. So that's what they were taking in. And under the current law and under this administration's plan, the bridge would get 100% share. So the federal government would pay 100% of that. And while you say that this is consistent with bridge collapse emergencies in the past, and I think you're referring to the I-35 collapse, that was not a toll bridge, right? That was part of the interstate system. And so my questions, I guess, center around payment for this. I think we can all agree that we probably and shouldn't wait for the insurance companies and the litigators to work it out, but Maryland had insurance on the bridge, didn't they?
Sir, I'm aware of one policy that Maryland has for $350 million.
$350 million, right?
Yes.
So that should, by all rights, you would assume, be actioned and go towards paying for a portion, whatever portion of the bridge reconstruction it would pay for, right? It would,
Absolutely, sir. I have yet to go through and have our lawyers figure out exactly what is in there. But yes, whatever portion of that $350 million we would apply.
So I guess when you say consistent with past emergencies, as you already said, the relief fund is $3.7 billion behind. We're $35 trillion this month in debt at the federal level. And I wonder if you think it's fair that the American taxpayer should not only pay to reconstruct the bridge, but then pay tolls after which to use the infrastructure they just paid for in their taxes. Is that because you're going to set a new precedent here, and is that the precedent we're going to set, or is there some plan to recoup the cost of reconstruction of the bridge? And I think according to the figures we've heard today, upwards of $2 billion, a bridge that originally cost $60.3 million. Is there some plan to recoup that and send that back into the disaster relief fund or to the highway fund, which continually needs massive infusions from the general fund just to stay afloat? What's the plan?
Yeah, thank you, sir. Very important questions, and I appreciate your interest. So let me just try to quickly go through that. Where this was a Maryland state facility before, now it's been designated as part of the interstate system. They were free before to collect their tolls and use them, for maybe Port of Baltimore, whatever they were using them for. Now, since this has been federalized as a facility and going forward when the tolls are restored, as part of the interstate system, they will have to use those for Title 23 eligible funding. So whether it's the maintenance of the existing bridge or other Title 23 highway purposes in Maryland. So the American taxpayer will be benefiting from those tolls. In terms of the precedent, if it was a pre-existing toll facility, they are allowed to toll the facility going forward. But again, it would be using Title 23 eligible expenditures on those tolls.
I understand the Title 23 expenditures and understand that they'd be used for surface transportation in Maryland, but you're asking the taxpayers from across the country to pay for it. And you know, if you're from Washington State, likely you're never going to travel across that bridge, but you're sure going to pay for it. And as long as we're setting precedent, I think it would be appropriate at least to consider reimbursing through the tolls the emergency fund or the transportation fund for the entire country before all of the money goes right back to the state that's going to be receiving it where the bridge resides, which arguably I think can be said was not prepared to withstand the traffic impact that it had. Meanwhile, it's right there. I mean, it's not like it was a surprise that the bridge is there and ships are going under it and this could happen. So with that in mind, you know, with the time that I've already expended and expired, I hope you would consider a plan to reimburse the taxpayer under horrific debt right now, who can't afford their groceries, their gas bills, their daycare bills for the cost of this bridge, for which one state has been receiving all the money for its entire existence, and apparently is going to receive all the money from the tolls for the rest of its existence. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance.
Mr. Garamendi, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the hearing. Witnesses, Vice Admiral and General, you and your teams and the support organizations that you've contracted with are doing extraordinary work, and we thank you for that. The issue before this committee was pretty much laid out by the chairman in his opening remarks. And I would suggest that we have an opportunity to clarify the responsibilities, some of which we heard from the previous member just a moment ago. A couple of things here. First of all, the notion, President Biden is correct. Okay, we'll put up the full cost of Reconstruction. However, that legislation should be written in such a way that the federal government will be reimbursed for any money received in the liability issues. The $350 million that the state of Maryland had as an insurance policy on the bridge, as well as whatever other payment may come from lawsuits against the shipping company and the owners of the ship. So if we should, and this should be really the work of this committee, is to carefully structure the legislation so that the federal government, ponying up the 100% at the outset, would be fully reimbursed by any revenues. My colleague raised an interesting point about tolls. We should consider that and how that fits into it, and keep in mind the entire interstate system where tolls are collected in various places across the United States. So those are things that are out there. There's also one other issue that I want to encourage this committee to deal with, in addition to recovering whatever money might be available from lawsuits. And that is the Limit of Liability Act of 1851. It seems as though perhaps even that precedes the law in Arizona, which dealt with a different issue. That Limit of Liability Act really has to change. And I would urge the committee to take up this issue. I intend to present to the committee at the appropriate time a piece of legislation to do so, so that the owners of these vessels would be held responsible for the cost of their mistakes. And that right now, that limited liability would hold that the owner of the ship would be limited to $40-some million, even though the ship is worth $90 million or more, and the damage is somewhere around $2 billion, not including the cost of the recovery issues and the expenses that the Coast Guard and the Army Corps of Engineers are now incurring. So my point here is to raise this policy issue and really the work of this committee as we go forward. I think the chairman correctly pointed out that we don't need to do much for the next couple of months, But this year, we have to pass legislation to clarify the ability of the federal government to receive any funds that are available from various lawsuits that are out there. And also, this committee should, since it is our jurisdictional area, deal with this 1851 law that limits the liability of the ship owner to any accident and problem that they may cause. Now, I don't know if this is an appropriate question for the General and the Vice Admiral, but you're welcome to jump in if you'd like. But I think, Mr. Bhatt, and if you might comment on this issue about how we might structure legislation to recover whatever damages may be in the future from either insurance or lawsuits. You can look for help, but you won't.
No, I just, you referenced them, and I just, so, you know,
No,
I'm taking a lot of the
it's
answers.
all yours.
So I want to, happy to share the time. So under the ER program, under the existing law as it states, any insurance monies that are recouped for any ER event across the country do go directly back into the ER fund. So the ranking member mentioned the $19 million Skagit River Bridge, and I think it was actually about $16.6 million that was recovered through insurance, went directly back in, but as he said correctly, 10 years after the incident. So whether it's the $350 million insurance policy that Maryland has existing, or post-investigation and post legal activity going on for as long as that may be, we will recover all of that money and send it back in. But as you correctly point out, there is some questions about how much liability for the ship owner that is out there.
That is a question really should be addressed to the Coast Guard, who might want to comment on it, but I'm out of time now, so I will yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Babin, you're recognized.
Sir, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here and your testimonies. I think there's definitely some resentment among my colleagues and the American public about this incident. The perception here is really frustrating, and you've already addressed some of these, but I'd like to ask my questions. If you zoom out, the Singapore flag vessel crashes into and completely destroys a historic bridge, kills 6 construction workers, and is now trying to avoid liability for the incident. People have a lot of questions. Is it safe for foreign flag vessels to operate in U.S. waterways? Are other bridges safe? I've heard a number of questions wondering whether their bridges are safe. Was this incident a result of foul play or negligence? What can we do to prevent this from ever happening again, and who is going to pay for this thing? And I appreciate you all for coming and answering questions. My first question is for Admiral Gautier. If anyone else has thoughts, please feel free to jump in. I know this whole response is a great team effort, but first off, I'm told the Coast Guard is doing a great job leading the way in the unified response in Baltimore. So I want to thank you and the Coast Guard for your commitment and all of the hard work that you and the Coast Guard have done. As you all know better than most, the Gulf states fought against the National Contingency Plan Unified Command Structure response throughout the Deepwater Horizon oil spill a few years ago in the Gulf of Mexico. The National Incident Commander's report concluded that the Gulf states' effort resulted in the political and social nullification of the oil spill response doctrine and structure governance. It appears from press reports, meetings with Maryland state officials, and member and staff trips to the wreck site that Maryland embraced the National Incident Command structure and that the response has worked well within that structure. Is the National Incident Command structure still an effective and efficient mechanism for coordinating federal interagency and state, local, federal interactions during incidents such as the Dali collision?
Congressman, thank you very much, first off, for the compliments to the Coast Guard. And I just have to also acknowledge the leadership of Colonel Pinchase, Army Corps of Engineers, Colonel Butler, Jim Harkins, and Jeff Donahoe, who are the state incident commanders. It's a fantastic leadership team. To answer your question, the incident command system is absolutely a fundamental principle by which this incident response has been successful. It's part of U.S. doctrine under the National Incident Management System. It's how we respond to hurricanes, oil spills, other types of incidents just like this. I think we now have a great deal of practice in the United States since the Deepwater Horizon in doing this. And I think what I will just observe is that this particular incident had a very tight connection between the operational commanders who were running the incident and elected leaders who all shared the same objectives. The elected leaders took the time and effort, governor, mayor, members of Congress, to keep up to date on what was going on and to provide the trade space to allow these folks to get on with the response.
Okay, thank you. Second question I'd like to address to Administrator Bhatt. I'd like to talk about the path forward from here for the Key Bridge. What is the plan to replace the bridge? My constituents are not wanting to pay for this thing. In my view, the company or the country responsible for the incident should be footing the bill, not the U.S. taxpayer. If the U.S. is ultimately going to pay for this bridge, it better come out of funds that we've already allocated. President Biden and Speaker Pelosi authorized trillions for infrastructure, and that should be including bridges. The last thing I want to do is to vote to spend another $1 or $2 billion on a new bridge. So, Administrator Bhatt, talk to me on what you see as a path forward here on the payment for this thing.
Thank you, Congressman. And just in terms of the rebuild path, Maryland DOT plans to issue their RFP close to Memorial Day. They'll select a preferred team in August, and then they're looking at construction completion in 2028 is a preliminary schedule. And in terms of the payment, as I've stated, right now there's a preliminary estimate, $1.7 to $1.9 billion. There's a $350 million insurance payment that we're working through to see what level of that would be applicable. And any funds that are recovered through legal activity or insurance payouts will go back into the ER funds. We just don't have a path to getting there right now in terms of what is eligible.
Okay, I'm out of time, so I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all.
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing, and thank you for the work that you've been doing to ameliorate the harm that has been caused by this bridge collapse. And I also want to offer my condolences to the families of the 6 construction workers who were killed in this bridge collapse. And I'd like to commend the quick work of the police officers who made sure that traffic was stopped and no other people were on the bridge who could have been killed as a result of this collapse. And I also want to recognize the collaboration between state and federal officials and agencies to address this situation. And I want to get at this issue of perhaps there being some people in the country who are not inside the state of Maryland who resent having to pay for this bridge reconstruction. Administrator Bhatt, can you tell us how this bridge collapse impacts interstate commerce?
Thank you for your condolences and for the question, Congressman. I think, I've been a Secretary of Transportation in Delaware, in Colorado, and I was a deputy in Kentucky, and I think that, what is so critically important for our transportation system is that you can drive from New York to Los Angeles across a system that is completely uniform, is set to standards, and what is happening, I think we've learned through the Port of Baltimore, is that that highway system is tied into ports. It's the 3rd busiest port in the country, so there are jobs that are being impacted, there's freight movements that are being impacted, there are neighborhoods that are being impacted, and so, yeah, this is not just an issue for Maryland, it's an issue for the Northeast Corridor and for our national economy.
It's actually having an impact on prices for consumer goods. Is that correct?
That is something that, under the leadership of Secretary Buttigieg, we've been closely looking at, many of the goods that move through there. So There's a lot of coal that moves through that port. There's a lot of automobiles and farm equipment. And so to the extent, now there's a lot of that traffic has been diverted, and I don't want to get outside of the federal highway lane to other ports, but there is a lot of movements of goods from, say, ships that have diverted back to Maryland, and that is adding costs for those, say, vehicles to be finished at the plants nearby. So
right.
obviously, supply chain is important.
Okay, thank you. When is it projected, assuming that funding is in place, that the bridge can be rebuilt and reopened?
Thank you, sir. The projected schedule right now is for a progressive design build team to be selected this summer and for construction to begin next year and run through 2028.
Thank you. And so it would be 2029 before the bridge would reopen for traffic?
Yeah, 2028, 2029, it'll be a progressive design build, so we'll figure out the schedule as we go.
Thank you. Chairwoman Homendy, you, with respect to the causation of this cargo vessel losing power and that causing this vessel to drift into the bridge, are there any concerns, or does the fact that there seems to be no redundancy in terms of the basic power of the vessel, there's no redundancy? You cut it on, it gets cut off, there's no secondary situation that would kick in. Am I correct on that? And if I am correct, what are the implications as we move forward?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly redundancy in the electrical system and the circuit breakers. They switched circuit breakers after the power outages in port. With respect to the emergency generator, it would not allow for regaining propulsion. It really focuses on the critical portions of the vessel, which would be radio communication, lighting. If you had any sort of, if you wanted to regain propulsion through any sort of emergency generator, it would literally take a 6-story generator on a vessel to do that. There is redundancy in, say, cruise ships, but vessels, the Dali is not unlike other vessels. I think here is really determining for us what happened with the electrical system on the accident voyage. What happened in those 2 blackouts, and which is why we have been working very closely with Homendy, who manufactures the equipment to try to replicate some of the electrical problems that we're seeing that day, and continue looking and testing each of the components.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first want to join others in wishing condolences to the families of those who were lost in the bridge collapse, and also I just find it remarkable the incredible action of the law enforcement community that came in and stopped traffic that could have been much worse than it was. Last week I had the opportunity to go out to the bridge, and Admiral, I'll tell you that Admiral was it Gilreath, right? Right, Admiral Gilreath and Captain O'Donnell and even Lieutenant Carter, who was behind you a little while ago, just absolutely remarkable. General Colonel, your district commander down there, Colonel Pinchason, I believe. Yeah, she was awesome. I'd met her down in New Orleans, and she and her team did a great job. They're folks from DHS that were really, really good, and just an incredibly thorough briefing, and gave lots of comfort that things were under control. And I appreciate all the efforts that are underway down there. Administrator, I want to ask a question. I want to make sure I understand something. You said earlier that what's being done in this bridge is consistent with what's been done in other bridges in the past. Is that for disasters? Is that accurate?
Thank you, Representative. I'm trying to think of what I said.
I wrote down that you said consistent with historic bridge disasters, but there's not another bridge where you just, where FHWA came in and just designated that it's going to be part of the interstate system.
No, we only learned that it was not part of the interstate system in light of this event.
Okay, so that is an anomaly. I just
Absolutely.
Okay, I want to be clear on that. And then secondly, so you've talked about the use of categorical exclusions and doing some type of expedited NEPA, whether you do a CAT-X or you do alternative arrangements. I want to be clear, fully supportive of it. But in the past, Minneapolis Bridge, the I-35 Bridge, I believe the bridge in Washington State, and others, similar things have been done. Can you cite where there's been environmental damages or destruction from that approach as opposed to going through the regular NEPA?
So just trying to think through your question, citing environmental damage by using the expedited approach. No, I can't cite environmental damage that way.
And I can't either. And actually, Major General Graham, sorry about that, demoted you. General, you recall after Hurricane Katrina, the levees were built using alternative arrangements. Do you remember any type of environmental damages or destruction that was caused from doing the alternative arrangements? Yeah, I don't think so either. I think it actually worked out really well. And so my message to you on this is that right now, the average road project takes somewhere around 7 years and 3 or 4 months. As you know, the White House has just released new rules on NEPA in line with the fiscal, well, attempting to be in line with the Fiscal Responsibility Act, but failing on some things, but that would significantly shorten it. But my message is that this shouldn't be the exception. The environmental damages haven't resulted from using categorical exclusions or alternative arrangements. Look, I don't know what the traffic impacts are of this bridge. We have a bridge at home that is the source of the 4th worst traffic problem in America. The Mississippi River Bridge, I-10 going from California to Florida. 4th worst traffic in America. We have taken 7 years to narrow a new bridge alignment down to 32 alignments. Like, you can't make this stuff up. This is outrageous. We have urgency there as well. Look, I want to be crystal clear. I fully support federal funding up front. Let's get this thing built. Let's get it done as quickly as possible. I fully support categorical exclusion or alternative arrangements. I've been in touch with the governor of Maryland, and I appreciate him reaching out. But this is a major anomaly. We've got a toll. We've got a responsible party. This isn't a natural disaster. And I think that we need to make sure that we're holding the responsible party accountable. We had a similar incident in Louisiana in the mid-90s, the Brightfield incident came and crashed into the Riverwalk in Louisiana. It was a Japanese-built vessel. It was run by Chinese. It was I think, run by Chinese and flagged in Liberia. Admiral, I want to ask you real quick, can you think of any similar incidents with Jones Act vessels that have occurred like this?
Not from deep draft vessels. Certainly, there are a number of towing vessels.
Sure, some barges and much more minor incidents. Chairman Homendy, are you aware of anything? And so, look, one thing I want to point out here, and for the record, she's shaking her head no. One thing I want to point out here, look, Jones Act vessels, U.S. built, U.S. crewed, U.S. flagged. We go through annual inspections. A night and day difference. And I think that's something else we need to take into consideration here. Lastly, Administrator, this bridge, it is not going to be built back exactly like it was. It's going to be wider. You're going to have shoulders. You're going to have a different pier configuration. You're going to have different tidal influences. You're going to have bumpers. You're going to have dolphins and other things protecting the pier structures. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right. I just want to make sure that we're noting that this is actually a different bridge that's being reconstructed with effectively waiving or providing alternative arrangements or categorical exclusions under NEPA. Yield back.
Ms. Titus.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And like everyone here, I too offer sympathy to the families of those who were lost. These people represent sometimes the invisible folks who are on the front lines, who provide safety and security in our infrastructure, and also the harbor workers and police officers who were there and made the situation much less terrible than it already was. I would ask the chairwoman and Administrator Bhatt about one of the things that's been pointed out in the study of the bridge. It seems like it didn't have a reliable fender system, I believe it's called, to protect the piers from the crash. I wonder if you have reviewed bridges in other major ports to determine whether or not they have those fenders in place. And if not, is there an existing program with funding that might be used to retrofit some of those other bridges to be sure they don't have the same problem? We can be, I hate the word, but proactive about that.
Thank you for the question. We've actually been recommending, we recommended back in 1988 that the Coast Guard and the Federal Highways evaluate the adequacy of pier protection on bridges over navigable waterways in U.S. ports and harbors. That recommendation remains closed, unacceptable, because at the time, the Coast Guard said they did not have the authority to take action on that evaluation. But if one thing I will say, and I hope that we walk away from this in considering, is the federal government states, bridge owners, they need to evaluate current structures and make sure if you have navigable waterway that you are doing a risk analysis to ensure safety, to ensure there's adequate pier protection. In this situation, we are looking at pier protection. We're looking at certainly the dolphins, but then the protection around the piers themselves. And then looking at different bridges across the United States to see how those have been improved over time. In this situation, you have a bridge that began operations in 1977, and if it was built today, it would be built differently. And so that has to be taken into consideration. I will say I'm very encouraged by what the Admiral announced, their Board of Inquiry, about looking at ports across the United States to make sure there is adequate protection, and I assume that it will include some of the structures as well, including bridges. So that's great.
Okay. Administrator Bhatt, would you like to comment on that?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And yes, we're obviously working closely with the NTSB and just really respect their thoughts and guidance. We have already reached out to our state DOT partners who are the owners of these bridges. Similar to when there's any kind of bridge tragedy after Minnesota, everybody is reaching out to figure out what fracture critical bridges they had. And so we're going to go out. We've already got a preliminary list. We're going to continue to identify. And again, it's the deep draft vessels, it's the barges, it's examining all the threats and then doing that cost-benefit analysis of what protections are sort of quickly deployable, how do we get these bridges protected, and then how do we update design standards given the ever-changing nature of the vessels going underneath them.
Well, can you use, I believe the acronym is BFP, Bridge Replacement, Rehabilitation, Preservation, Protection, and Construction Program. Is that available with any kind of funding or that can be used to retrofit some of these bridges if they don't meet these requirements you're talking about?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, so in the bipartisan infrastructure law, there was $12.5 billion allocated for discretionary grant funding and about, I think, $30 billion on the formula side. Seismic protection, as has been retrofitting, is possible. And this is something that we're going to look into as we work with our state partners who are applying for those funds.
Well, as you look into it, if you find any problems with the program that won't allow it to work towards retrofitting in a situation like this or make it more difficult, will you let us know so if we need to make some changes, we can address those legislatively?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Rouser, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to extend my condolences to the family and all those who were injured in this very tragic happening. General Graham, I'll start with you. Last week, the Corps announced it would reprogram appropriated dollars specific to other Corps projects towards the efforts at Baltimore Harbor. It's our understanding these funds were appropriated in fiscal year 2020 or earlier and have been determined to be more than what's needed for those authorized projects. Is that an accurate portrayal? Is that correct?
That's accurate.
So this has created a bit of confusion among members and even the committee here. Back home, for example, we've got the Wilmington District has seen several projects whose funds have been repurposed, notably Wilmington Harbor, Morehead City Harbor, and New River Inlet all had hundreds of thousands of dollars redirected from their maintenance accounts. Can you provide the committee with the amount of reprogrammed dollars, a list of the projects you are reprogramming those funds from, and which districts those projects are in?
Absolutely.
Because we would greatly appreciate those answers as quickly as possible. And then the question everybody's got on their mind is, how much money is sitting out there that is in an account that was appropriated in 2020 or earlier that has been left unused? I'd like to know the answer to that question too. And then following up, does the Corps plan to use Section 101A8 authority again in the future? And if so, are there any limitations to the number of times the Corps can utilize that authority within a specific time frame?
Rouser, probably we will have to use the emergency reprogramming authority again. As I stated in my opening statement, we have not used that authority at this scale for 15 years. And we understand that Congress puts specific amounts of money on specific projects, and you intend it to be used for those projects. In these instances, as stated earlier, most of these funds were the result of bid savings. They were the result of we held on to additional money to settle claims with contractors. And so it's a relatively a good news story that we saved the taxpayers money. To your statement on our accounting procedures, do those need to be looked at so that those funds aren't, old funds aren't sitting out there? Absolutely, and we're committed to that.
Thank you. Following up, given these funds are well on their way to being reprogrammed, does the Corps plan to return any funds to those districts? What's your plan there? And if so, what would that timeline be?
To make sure I understand the question correctly, the districts had no uses for these funds, and so as such, we don't plan to return them. If they come up with and say, we do need some of these, we'll work with them to make sure that those projects can be delivered.
Sure. Well, every district has a disaster of some sort at some point, and I suspect that all those Army Corps districts around the country like to be able to have a little flexibility to tap into funding that was allocated specific to projects within their jurisdiction, which is why I asked that question. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I think that exhausts my line of questioning. I yield back.
North Carolina yields back. Mr. Carvajal, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I recently made a visit to the Francis Scott Key Bridge incident with a number of my colleagues to see it firsthand. Admiral Gautier, the Coast Guard has an obligation to respond to all marine casualties, but incidents of this size have an outsized impact on Coast Guard resources. This incident, unfortunately, comes at a time of strained resources and a 10% workforce shortage. What is the operational strain on the Coast Guard's responding to the bridge collapse, and how can Congress help? And what is the impact on the workforce?
Congressman, we've mobilized people from across the country. We've activated reservists to staff the command post and to respond here. We've used cutters and small boats from around the area, helicopters and so on, to do this response. So there's an immediate area impact to readiness, certainly, but what we know is that for unplanned incidents like this, where we mobilize a lot very quickly, there are also readiness impacts that happen well beyond the initial site. And so I think in terms of, and going into what's likely to be a pretty severe hurricane season, I think the main thing here is that in order for the Coast Guard to reconstitute and be ready for the next one, we need to have continued and enduring financial appropriation support from Congress. We spent about $20 million so far in direct and indirect costs here, but we know that our readiness in the waterways management field is brittle. We're short aids to navigation. There's a cutter that's on scene as a patrol commander that is 62 years old. the Coast Guard cutter Sledge. We are working to recapitalize that class of cutter and the Waterways Commerce cutter. And this is repeated again and again in terms of aircraft recapitalization, major cutter recapitalization support for our people.
Thank you. Admiral Gautier, the IMO ensures minimum global standards for safe shipping practices. The U.S. flagged vessels are subject to higher standards and scrutiny. This is one of the several reasons I believe it is unacceptable that we rely on flag of convenience vessels to carry over 98% of our international cargo. There's a small minority of my colleagues who believe that the Jones Act should be repealed. I am not one of them. How would your job of ensuring safety in U.S. waters be made more difficult if U.S. vessels sailing in our coastal waterways and inland rivers were supplanted by foreign ships with foreign mariners?
Congressman, your question is related to safety and the Coast Guard implications of safety. The Jones Act has been with us for 100 years. It's pretty foundational to how maritime commerce flows in the United States. And the Coast Guard's worked very hard to provide an equivalent level of safety from foreign flag vessels, foreign crews at IMO through established standards. But what I really can say here is that the Jones Act is crucial for our maritime security elements in terms of the industrial shipbuilding capability in the United States of America that the Coast Guard and that the Navy and Marin and others rely on in terms of construct our U.S. flag military and public vessels as well. And we do not want in any way, shape, or form to jeopardize that maritime security element of the defense industrial complex through shipbuilding.
Chair Homendy, it is common practice for American mariners working on U.S. flagged ships to work on board a vessel for 2 to 3 months at a time. Mariners sailing on a flag of convenience vessels often remain at sea for longer. In the case of the Dali, I understand that the engineers have been on board for more than 8 months. Since your preliminary report showed at least one mistake by the engineer, should we be concerned with the prevalence of flag of convenience vessels which operate with lower standards, operating in and around critical U.S. infrastructure?
Well, we are still on scene and evaluating everything about this accident. We will look at any sort of federal regulations or IMO standards to make sure they're adequate, but it's too early to tell.
What about the standards? If they abide by lower standards, that shouldn't be of concern?
I'm not saying it's not a concern. I'm saying we have to evaluate with this particular accident what was in place and whether that was adequate or not.
But beyond this incident, is there a concern?
I will have to get back to you on that for the record.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. Boss from Illinois for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to associate myself with the comments of the concern for the families and the prayers for a tragedy such as this, and also to thank the people that responded so well and are doing the work. But, you know, ensuring that our nation's infrastructure is secure and maintained is an important responsibility of our Congress. But it's also important to have uniform guidelines in place to know how infrastructure is going to be paid for. Now, in my district, when local communities reach out for assistance with grants to do road work, they know that local cost share is at 20%. Now, just recently, my district had on Highway 51, US 51, we had to close, and it's going to be closed for quite some time because a sinkhole opened up. And the local community will need to repair the road, and there will be a cost connected with that work. However, I don't expect the community to try to redesignate the road to be considered part of the interstate highway system to take care of that. Mr. Bhatt, despite being located on Interstate 695, the Key Bridge was not part of the interstate highway system. The incident that caused the collapse of the bridge occurred in March,
and yet the bridge designation wasn't applied to be changed until April. Are you aware of of this change cost share requirements for this road? And is it normal, or is it normal for a road change to be designated after an incident?
Thank you for the question, Representative. This is the first time I'm aware of redesignating a road.
Me too. So can you explain, for the sake of the taxpayers and the people around this country that also have issues, how a roadway has its designated change suddenly after repair work was identified? Because I can tell you the constituents I represent would like to try to figure out how to do that. Because that's why I'm just trying to figure it out, because we have uniform rules in place. And if we're going to change them, we're the ones you come to. I need answers.
Yeah, so, sorry, Representative, I didn't mean to cut you off there. Yes, and apologies to the community that had the sinkhole. I'm sure that is quite a impactful event for that community. In this case, this portion of I-695 was part of the NHS. It was shielded as part of the interstate since it was built in the 1970s. I think there was so for mapping purposes, it was part of it. There were some standards that were a little bit different, that when they applied to have it designated, we had to do the process of waivers, and that got it from the 80-20 share to the 90-10 share. And so I think my assumption before this incident was that that bridge and that section of I-695 was part of the interstate. So this was just at the request of Maryland to have it redesignated as part of it. And we get those requests. There are parts of the interstate system that are shielded, but not necessarily part of it. There was an example in Alabama a few years ago.
Okay, and you do that just through administrative rule. It doesn't require an act of Congress.
Does not. They would need to come in and say, this is why, these are the design exceptions, whether it's the curves or some of the other elements that they might have had in there, and then our engineers would have to say, yes, this is why we would approve those exceptions.
And you've got to understand the concerns of uniformity, and I understand, believe me, I'm not arguing, let's not fix it as fast as possible. I'm not arguing that, hey, whatever the cost is, as we're trying to recoup, as was mentioned by several people questioning, insurance is not going to pay off overnight. There's going to be arguments. There's going to be all of that, and we're going to fight for that. And we need to get it fixed quickly. It's just other communities around the nation have issues that come up, and that not having a set standard on how it is we respond and how we can get a response back to our own communities makes it very difficult when you do something that isn't normal in this situation, and then we just have to have answers. So I appreciate that. With that, I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and I recognize Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, for hosting this hearing, and thank you to all of the witnesses. I want to echo the sentiment of other members who are remembering the tragic loss of life of 6 workers, all of them immigrants from Mexico and Central Americans, all of them seeking a better life in this country, meeting a very tragic fate. So as we rebuild the Key Bridge, we must also advocate for stronger workplace protections for all, including immigrant workers. And this brings me to my first question, Administrator Bhatt. The Coast Guard's testimony states that 8 construction workers were on the bridge at the time of the collision, and that 1 worker was able to run to safety. If there had been more time when the ship's loss of power was reported and when the collision happened, is there a protocol in place for bridge worker evacuation in an event such as this collision? And if so, can you describe it?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question and for your concern for the workers. Obviously, all work zones in America are dangerous places, and we have rules in place for the both the state or the city that is procuring the contract and for the companies that are out there. I want to defer to others here, but what I learned through our discussions is that there was a police officer who was attempting to reach the work crew on the bridge to evacuate them, but just given the proximity of the ship was unable to make it to the crew before the bridge struck.
Do you think the protocol is adequate?
Sir, I would need to think about that and consult with some of our experts. Obviously, this was an unprecedented event, so I just want to evaluate that and get back to you for the record.
Chair, how many?
Yeah, other bridge structures, they have advanced warning systems, and we'll look at that as part of our investigation. But I will just say, from the time the pilot's dispatcher called MDTA police and the bridge was ordered closed was 52 seconds. 52 seconds. That was the time of, it's almost impossible to get in that situation, to get a longer time. And if you just look at the time from the blackout to the bridge strike, it was 4 minutes total. But I appreciate your question because it is really tragic what occurred, and we want to prevent that from reoccurring, and that's our whole mission, which is why we'll look at advanced warning systems as well.
And thank you for that. And Administrator Bhatt, if you could get back to me, it'd be greatly appreciated. To Vice Admiral Gautier, the Dali had been inspected by the Coast Guard about 6 months prior to the incident with the Key Bridge. It's unusual that a major malfunction like this could occur with no previous indication of faulty systems after being cleared by an inspection of only 6 months prior. And what are the requirements on foreign flagged, foreign-owned vessels to report any malfunctions to the Coast Guard when operating at a U.S. port?
The Coast Guard has a requirement for any vessel that suffers an issue to notify on what we call a reportable marine casualty. And there are a variety of qualifications, sort of circumstances by which you have to notify the Coast Guard of those casualties.
Thank you much. Lastly, very briefly to all of the panelists who'd like to chime in, although the NTSB investigation is ongoing, recommendations are forthcoming, what's needed from Congress, if anything, to improve worker safety?
So I'll speak first. It's critically important for us to have the fulsome results of the investigation, I think, before we move ahead with any sorts of implementations based on those recommendations. I will say, so the Coast Guard is conducting a Marine Board of Investigation in coordination with NTSB and cooperation. If we find something in the near term that we think is important and urgent enough to do an advisory on, we will go ahead and do that.
Thank you.
Chair? Sir, this could happen in any of your districts, right? And and I would say where you have navigable waterways, whoever's owning, I keep reiterating this, if you own a bridge, if a state owns a bridge or other entity owns a bridge, look at the current structure, do a risk assessment. You can do that now. You don't have to wait until we issue an urgent recommendation or come to the conclusion of our investigation. Make sure you're ensuring safety for what's going through on that bridge or in the navigable waterways now.
Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair. Thank you for your indulgence.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. Westerman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. And my first question is going to be for the Coast Guard and the NTSB. Obviously, everybody just about has offered their condolences to the families of the people who lost their lives, but I'm thinking if I were a family member, I would want more than condolences. I would have questions that I wanted answered. And the first question is why? I think from the information that we've received so far, the explanation would be we had vulnerable infrastructure and we had a ship that lost power. But I think there's a deeper question as to why. And also, what are we going to do about that so that it doesn't we don't get a repeat incident. If the ship had had a tug escort, would it have hit the bridge even after it lost power?
We're looking into that as part of our investigation. I can't answer that right now. It's a question that we have, but it is something we're delving into.
The same for the Coast Guard. We don't know whether there was sufficient time to have made a difference or whether it would have added to the casualty or not.
I hope that's something that you're looking into and looking at other places around the country where these large ships are passing by vulnerable infrastructure without tugs. I know Mr. Graves talked about the ship in New Orleans, and from my understanding, all those ships down there now have tug escorts. Mr. Bhatt, you're here to discuss the need for a massive bridge reconstruction that will require years-long effort and billions of dollars from the American taxpayer. Meanwhile, those very taxpayers have been waiting for over 2 years for FHWA to perform repairs to a washed-out gravel road on White Rock Mountain in Franklin County, Arkansas, in my district. This road provides access to Forest Service concessionaire facilities, not to mention critical passage for emergency services in the area. The project has already been funded, but is apparently so tied up in red tape that my office can't even get a clear answer from your agency on when the washout will be filled. If FHWA is unable to reconstruct a gravel road in less than 2 years and counting, why should we trust your agency with billions in funding for a project of this magnitude?
Thank you, Congressman. I'm happy to go back and take a look and figure out exactly what is going on with that project and report back to your office.
Thank you. And this, I guess, would be for the Corps and for Mr. Bhatt, but there's an issue that happened in Floyd Bennett Field, which is a National Park Service facility in New York City. And you may ask, what in the world does that have to do with this project? But I'll tell you what it has to do. This administration used alternative arrangements to waive every NEPA and environmental regulation in the Park Service to build a migrant camp, and they did that in less than 2 weeks. They waived all those regulations. I'm wondering if the administration has the intent to use alternative arrangements, not just CEs, but alternative arrangements to repair this bridge, which is obviously very vital infrastructure.
So we are in close coordination with Maryland DOT. We are not going to waive NEPA, but it is our strong likelihood that we'll end up with a categorical exclusion because we're replacing a bridge in relatively the same footprint that existed before.
Does the administration have the legal authority to waive NEPA, to use alternative arrangements to even go beyond the CE?
Sir,
the answer is yes, and they can do that. And it's amazing to me that they would do it on a Park Service facility that 1 million visitors in New York City use to build a migrant camp, yet it doesn't seem to be an option on the table to rebuild this vital piece of infrastructure. And I hope the administration would not only afford this same luxury to critical infrastructure, but also to a lot of smaller projects around the country that get tied up in the process when the administration has full authority to do that. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I recognize Mr. Stanton for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to each of the witnesses for your hard work in responding to this critical emergency in our country. And like every member of this committee, I do send my deepest condolences to the families of the 6 human beings, the workers who lost their lives as a result of this tragic incident. When the Dali crashed into the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Maryland, we saw the agencies represented here today jump into action. But the road to rebuild is long and it requires coordination between our local, state, and federal governments. As a former mayor myself, I understand how critical intergovernmental cooperation is for efficiency and speedy results. Administrator Bhatt, to my understanding, one of the ways the Federal Highway Administration responded to the disaster was by reclassifying the bridge as an interstate. Tell us more about the purpose of that reclassification and how will that help with speedy bridge repair?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. We received a request from Maryland DOT shortly after the bridge disaster to reclassify, and so we went through the usual process that we would do for any state DOT that was asking to come in. I think our assumption had been that it was part of the interstate since it was shielded and was on maps that way. Just going back, the difference will be that instead of being part of the NHS, it will be officially it is now officially part of the interstate and goes from an 80-20 cost share to a 90-10.
That's great. Another important action taken at the outset of the disaster was the quick release of emergency relief program funds, a reimbursable program. I understand it was $60 million that was released in March. That's a sizable amount. How was that $60 million number decided?
Thank you, Congressman. So we have been in close contact with Maryland DOT from the early hours. Specifically, I think this is a great example of the quick release funding being put to work. They actually had a contractor who could mobilize very quickly, had cranes in the area, and while the Army Corps was focused on the navigable channel, that $60 million is helping to clear wreckage simultaneously from the non-navigable waterways.
And obviously, the cost will be significant above and beyond the initial amount. Tell us the role that the emergency relief program will play in additional funds for bridge repair and any other federal highways programs that will likely need to be utilized in this important work.
Yeah, and so as thank you, Congressman, for some of the questions that have come in, the first 270 days, the emergency, repair work is funded at 100, and then longer-term permanent repair work is funded at 90-10. Traditionally, through this program, the initial estimate is around $1.7 to $1.9 billion for the bridge. It'll be a 4-year construction, and that is that critical piece where Maryland will have the certainty that federal funding will be available so that they can move forward with their procurement.
That's great. Lastly, it's my understanding that one of the primary roles of the Federal Highway Administration currently is to also give technical assistance to the Maryland Department of Transportation. Is there anything you can share with us today regarding those conversations as the federal partners to Maryland DOT?
Thank you, and Congressman, I do want to recognize our federal highway staff that have been on site and in close coordination, both in Maryland and in headquarters. So we are meeting with them on the emergency work, on getting the ER funding, on the procurement, on the elements of the bridge design that are going to be out there. So it is a really strong partnership that exists.
We appreciate the work of yourself, FHA, all the other agencies represented today. It is critical that we get the bridge rebuilt as soon as possible, not only for Baltimore, City of Baltimore, State of Maryland, but the entire economy of the United States of America. So thank you for your work you've already done and the work you will do on this important project. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and I recognize Mr. Mast for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you all for your testimony. Mr. Bhatt, would this be an accurate way to categorize you? You're in charge of collecting the checks for the future project?
Sorry, Congress, I'm in charge of collecting checks for the future project?
Money. You're in charge of getting the money for the project?
Yes.
Okay. Have you received any money from any insurer yet?
No, sir.
Which insurers have you sought monies from?
So to be clear, the insurance policy that we are talking about is an insurance policy for the Maryland Department of Transportation. And so we're working with Maryland DOT to work through the elements of that insurance policy.
Nothing for any insurance company of Grace Ocean Private LTD?
So the Department of Justice is leading efforts around for the efforts for the United States to recover the funds, so that's not a federal highway function.
Nothing also for you in terms of requesting anything from insurers of Maersk who chartered that vessel from Grace?
No, sir. The Federal Highway Administration role in this is the debris removal in the non-navigable waterway, and then working with Maryland DOT to rebuild the bridge, we will take back any insurance funds that come in and reimburse the ER program.
What has Department of Justice told you to this point about, have they requested monies from any of those insurers or any other companies?
Sir, I would not be able to comment on Department of Justice efforts. I know they're working on it, I'm not aware.
So they haven't had any contact with you about requesting monies. You can comment about your involvement, your conversation with them, not necessarily what they've done.
Specifically, sir, the only email that I've received is from DOJ to preserve all of my emails for upcoming and likely years-long litigation.
Why is it likely years-long litigation?
Again, sir, I can only speak to my efforts around bridge building and litigation that occurs when there's a claims between a contractor and a state where they don't feel that the product it meets. That can take years. So billions of dollars and international maritime law, I can only assume will be a fairly lengthy process.
None of us are naive enough to say that insurance companies just readily come out and offer us large payouts for things that are insured. We would be naive to say that. It's just not the state of the world. But in the midst of this catastrophe, I guess is a great word to categorize it. Have you seen anything or heard anything from DOJ about these insurance companies offering anything or trying to say that they do not have liability for this?
Sir, to be, I would need to come back to you. I would have to check with our chief counsel, our general counsel at DOT, and other agencies. But I'm happy to come back on that question.
I appreciate that. Have you heard anything about whether they've already executed any type of business interruption insurance for the vessel that's not in use right now?
Sir, I am not aware of that.
Okay. And a lot of these questions, again, I appreciate you listening to. You don't have the answers for them. Madam Chairwoman, I would encourage this committee to get some of the other entities in here, since we're talking significantly across both sides of the aisle about the funding for this bridge, the timing for the repairs of this bridge, things peripheral to that. That we bring in the insurance companies for conversation, the shipping companies for conversation about this as well. And I would hope that we would do that in the next, maybe next week that we're in session. But it's certainly sensical that we speak to you all about this, but it's also sensical that we speak to the private entities that are involved in this as well. I thank you for your testimony. I thank you for the time, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and I now recognize Ms. Fushi for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, and thank you to the chairs for holding this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for being here with us today. The tragic events that took place in the early morning hours of Tuesday, March 26th, were a tragedy not simply for Baltimore or Maryland, but for the nation. I join my colleagues in mourning the 6 lives lost in this catastrophic accident. While I have been heartened by the response of the Baltimore community, who have, at last count, already fundraised over $500,000 to support the families of the Key Bridge victims, it is the responsibility of both the federal government and the private sector to ensure something like this never happens again, which is at least, in part, why we're here today. The Biden administration, the state of Maryland, the Coast Guard, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, among others, have taken commendable initiative and swift action in responding to this crisis, something that has been highlighted by the witnesses here today. I want to thank all of you for being here. I know your time is valuable, especially in the midst of an ongoing situation like this. So my colleagues and I, we greatly appreciate your time and your testimonies. I think most of us on this committee understand that this matter is going to require expeditious bipartisan support here in Congress. If we wish to mitigate at best, we can get to the economic and the supply chain ripple effects of the FSK bridge collapse. However, I believe it's worth noting that there are also some significant road safety implications here, as well as even further that underscore this need for congressional support. With the port no longer at full capacity, commercial trucks are being forced to take roads through residential areas that aren't equipped for that kind of traffic. Chairwoman Homendy and Administrator Bhatt, can either of you speak to the traffic safety issues to other vehicles on the roads, to pedestrians, or to the residential road infrastructure that have either already emerged as a result of the FSK bridge closure or are at risk of emerging should access to the port remain limited?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Obviously, there is thank you for noting the traffic impacts. I would just, in the interest of time, I would highlight the hazmat traffic that, the hazmat materials are not allowed in the tunnels through Baltimore. And so that was one of the critical elements of the Francis Scott Key Bridge, was to provide hazmat material to move around. And now what's happening is they're rerouting around the north side of 695. It goes through neighborhoods, and it's suboptimal from a routing perspective. So that's just one example. And then obviously, as you mentioned, there are trucks and other commercial vehicles and just higher levels of traffic working their way through residential areas now as well.
This is an issue that I would typically defer to Federal Highways just because we're just focused on the investigation itself. So thank you.
Thank you. I, like many of my colleagues, have been particularly concerned about the regional implications on unemployment that the bridge collapse and reduction of port operations are having on the surrounding community. As the state of Maryland has estimated that 270,000 jobs will ultimately be impacted. Even so, I've been especially encouraged by the efforts thus far of the Biden administration to support the plethora of temporarily displaced workers who have had their employment either directly or indirectly impacted since the events of March 26th. For instance, the administration funneled an initial tranche of $3.5 million to the region via its Dislocated Workers Grant Program back in April to support temporary cleanup and recovery employment opportunities for those who've lost their jobs due to the FSK bridge incident, with more support funds on the way. Vice Admiral Gautier and Major General Graham, can you speak to the efforts of the U.S. Coast Guard and the Army Corps, respectively, about the ongoing efforts to restore services and access to the port, given the widespread ramifications such efforts will have on employment in the region?
Well, let me go first because I want to do a shout out to the Army Corps of Engineers. Commerce is flowing. The depth of the channel has been restored to 48 of 50 feet. It's narrower than what it typically is, but is sufficient for Coast Guard to put one-way vessel and tug escort controls to get traffic in and out. And so we've seen over 35 deep draft vessels that have transited, over 300 smaller barges and other things that have been able to transit in and out. And so I think what we're seeing is that the system is restoring itself to normal functions while we work together in unified command to make sure the full channel width and depth is restored.
And ma'am, working with the port in the state of Maryland, to open up as many alternate channels as we could. Small craft, and we successfully got to larger and larger craft. As Vice Admiral Gautier said, we were able to get a 35, now about 40, 48-foot channel to get those key car carriers moving, and we remain committed to getting the full channel open by the end of this month.
Madam Chair, that's my time. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back, and I recognize Mr. Yackham for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I, too, want to offer my condolences to the families who lost loved ones in this disaster. And I want to thank our witnesses not just for being here, but also for the tireless work that you and your agencies have done in putting into the recovery efforts, but also the investigative matters that you've undertaken as we look into this disaster even deeper. So thank you. Before I get to my questions about the topic at hand, Administrator Bhatt, I feel the need to follow up on a conversation we had in December when you were before this committee. You may recall that we discussed the NEVI and the CFI programs, which have a combined $7.5 billion at their disposal to build electric vehicle charging stations. As of the December hearing, NEVI had bought just one charging station online in 2 years. I asked you how many charging stations you expected those programs would bring online in 2024, and you promised to follow up with a, quote, very specific number. But in March, you sent a response that contained no specific number. You noted that hundreds of millions of dollars had gone out the door to build 7,500 ports. But there was no indication as to how many, if any, of those would be brought online this year. And thus far in 2024, NEVI has been responsible for 6 charging stations, again, with roughly $7.5 billion at its disposal. And there doesn't appear to be any public information for the completed CFI chargers. Administrator Bhatt, I want to give you one more chance here. How many more NEVI and CFI funded charging stations do you expect to be brought online for this year?
Thank you, Representative, and thank you for the follow-up. So we are working closely with our state DOT partners and cities across the nation. We're also working closely with the joint office that has been set up between Department of Energy and Department of Transportation. Since that time, there have been several states that have brought online NEVI chargers. Those have been in Vermont, Ohio, Kentucky, Utah is going to have their first. So there are dozens, and I will get you the specific number, but dozens that we are anticipating coming online just in the next couple of months. 35 of those states have their solicitations out. And then specifically on CFI, on January 5th, we rolled out $623 million in grants in January for CFI nationwide. And those we're working with grant agreements now to get those built this year.
So again, how many do you think will be brought online this year total? Just to give just a ballpark number.
Probably in the hundreds to in the thousands range this year. And again, I want to differentiate between DFC chargers and the level 2 chargers that are obviously replacing ones that are existing on the network.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And I do want to make sure that as we go throughout the balance of the year, we stay in touch on this particular topic. We've allocated $7.5 billion, and we're as of just a month ago, we were at 8 total chargers, and we want to make sure that the money that has been appropriated by this Congress is spent wisely. Turning our attention to the Key Bridge, Administrator Bhatt, I want to build on what Mr. Boss talked about with his redesignation of the bridge as an interstate system. I share his sentiments that we should get this bridge rebuilt quickly, but I believe we should also be mindful of new precedents that we set and establish as we go through this whole process. You mentioned that part of an Alabama highway was redesignated as a part of the interstate system. How long did that process take from application to approval?
This was back in, sir, I'd have to go back to you on the exact dates, but probably a few weeks. And actually, to be clear, I think that was changing the main line of the interstate with the bypass. So maybe not exactly apples and apples.
Maryland's request to redesignate this as an interstate was made after the collapse. Is that correct?
Yes.
Does your agency have the authority to retroactively designate damaged or destroyed infrastructure as a part of the interstate system?
Sir, I would have to clarify on our exact authority and the retroactive piece. I just know that we received the request after the incident, and we went through our typical process and designated as part of the interstate.
Is there any precedent for retroactively designating damaged or destroyed infrastructure as a part of the interstate system?
Sir, I'd have to come back to you on that. I'm not aware.
Yeah, I would very much like to know if your agency was within its authority to retroactively designate this as an interstate as opposed to its former designation as a part of the state highway systems. Thank you. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and I recognize Mr. DeSaulnier.
Thank you.
For 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. Just a horrible event. Ms. Homendy, or all of you, but I want to direct this question to you. In 2007, near the district I represent in the Bay Area, there was a similar incident with the San Francisco Bay Bridge. It's the second busiest toll bridge after the George Washington Bridge in the United States.
but it is the terminus of Interstate 80. So what happened there was the fender system in California had gone further, kept the bridge from being damaged, but it still had to be shut down so that you and Caltrans could go through and make sure it was safe, plus it's seismically vulnerable. So what do we do in cases like that, 2007, where lessons learned are looked at and sort of consistent with some of the other questions, irrespective of whether it's part of the federal highway system, and just making sure that state departments of transportation, that they know what the best practices are for their area?
Well, for our role as part of an investigation agency, we continue to share lessons learned as part of any investigation, including with state departments of transportation. Certainly, we've conducted a number of investigations involving vessel strikes on bridges and have shared those lessons learned and continue to do so, and to continue to advocate even for recommendations that have been closed unacceptable. But I will say that the Federal Highway Administration also has close contact with their state partners to continue to highlight safety issues and risk assessment as well.
Vice Admiral, this happened very close to your admiral's, the regional, his home was beautiful on Treasure Island, but in that instance, also, they were required to have bar pilots come in. So it's Oakland is the fourth busiest port in the United States. A lot of traffic goes through there, but again, we've got lots of bridges, and the Bay Bridge closest to it. So a lot of the operations of that port, they work closely with the Coast Guard to make sure that the management of the transportation system works, and it works properly in terms of the whole transportation system. So in this case, a heavily traveled bridge. How does your department and the Coast Guard coordinate, again, on your experience around the world, on how to make sure that these structures that are run by state transportation agencies, particularly if they're not part of the interstate, has the best information about the dangers to marine traffic, commercial marine traffic?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. I'm familiar with the Costco Busan incident that you're referring to, and done many years of operations there in the Bay Area. We're doing a Marine Board of Investigation. We, just like we did in Costco Busan, we do an investigation of findings of fact, and then we recommend and take remedial actions based on that. But I think what we're talking about here is a little bit different in terms of the system as you've mentioned it. And so the Coast Guard does have a set of tools, risk management tools, that we get together with stakeholders in any given port to evaluate the totality of the risk if something changes, like if a channel becomes deeper or if a new bridge gets built and so on. One comes to mind as a Port and Waterways risk assessment. One was done in Baltimore, but not since 2001. So as a result of this incident, the Coast Guard is initiating a board of inquiry under my signature, which will look at how the Coast Guard does these assessments, how recent they are in the ports around the country, and to examine the top 10 ports for some lessons learned, including bridge fendering systems, hazards to navigation, and so on, together with stakeholders so we can draw some conclusions and then move out with a refined toolkit to other ports around the country.
Come back to Ms. Homendy. It's part of just the most recent report about human error on the boat. Reminds me of some of our discussions about the aviation industry. There's a lot of pressure on these companies to move product and show a profit. Are you concerned the same thing, that we're not providing enough oversight to the people who are running the ships in the system and they're being overworked, so they're missing things, whether it's people who are mechanics repairing the ships or people who are operating the ships?
Well, with respect to what occurred in port on March 25th, there was routine maintenance going on the vessel, and it was not something that stood out to us as, I mean, there's human error in everything we do, routine maintenance, and if we're working on our cars in our garage, sometimes we make mistakes. In this case, a damper was closed and an engine failed. So, in these situations, the crew took action to get everything back up and running, and on the next day they were on a different set of breakers and a different transformer. So we'll look at that as part of the investigation, including any sort of human error that occurred on the 25th or the 26th.
And I wasn't inferring a blame on the crew's part, it's just the pressure on the company to make profits. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The gentleman yields, and I recognize Mr. LaMalfa for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And appreciate panelists coming here today. I've been looking forward to this hearing on this topic here. We have a lot of bridge history in this country, especially in recent years. And expediting the reconstruction of this is critical, I'm certain, to Baltimore and the Eastern Seaboard, as it would be, you know, in any area of the country with a artery like that. So what I'm especially interested in is what is being done, and anybody on the panel that wants to weigh in, to truly expedite this process. Because when you read about it, when you get information about it, it sounds like there's a lot of preliminaries that are, of course, necessary with the demolition of the old bridge and such. But where I get frustrated is a bog down of studies and NEPA and things of that nature with an already existing structure. This is not a pristine area. And so what is being done to make a concurrent effort to do that stuff and get categorical exclusions, but also at the same time be moving forward as quickly as possible? And some examples I have of successes, as just Mr. Desaulnier alluded to, in California. Now there was the Bay Bridge '89 earthquake, you know, during the World Series, you may remember, where about a 250-ton chunk of that collapsed. And I'm not sure how quickly they got that put back up, but it wasn't terribly long when they put their minds to it. On the obverse side of that coin, you have the actual replacement of the Bay Bridge took 24 years. You know, in '89, when you decided there's a problem with the bridge, it was decided. It wasn't completed till 2013. They started construction in '02 and completed in '13. So that's an 11-year actual construction time, but a 24-year decision to actually and to completion. The '94 Northridge earthquake knocked down significant chunks of freeway in Southern California, and the initial estimates, I believe, at the time by Caltrans or others, like, oh, this is going to take 3 years, which would just put a giant crimp in in movement and commerce in Southern California. So the state, you know, and the Governor Wilson, put out a call for shortening that timeline from basically 3 years to 140 days. And one of the people involved was this company called C.C. Myers Construction Company. They got it done not just in 140 days, but 66 days with a large incentive, a large bonus possible. So on one hand, you know, and then the MacArthur Maze in Oakland, I'm not my time here, but there was a problem there. I believe that was the fire. Anyway, they got done in 27 days with a bonus involved as well with the C.C. Myers Company. Unfortunately, they're out of business now. Mr. Myers passed. So what can be done as far as incentives to actually speed up the process and not take 6 years, a paralysis of Baltimore, but set aside bureaucracy and get it done in 3, let's say, okay? I mean, realistically. So anybody on the panel?
So, Congressman, just, and thank you for your question and your examples that you've provided. I would just say that we share your desire to reopen the bridge as quickly as possible. I would say that Federal Highways worked with Maryland to get a programmatic CE for the debris removal in April, so that they weren't waiting around for an approval to get the debris out of the channel. And we are working. They are going to issue their RFP later this month, hopefully get somebody under contract by August, which is within 5 months of the incident, and we'll hopefully be able to get them to a categorical exclusion. And they're looking at a 4 years of construction. So the plan right now is for that bridge to be reopened in 2028. which I don't know that there's any other authority that we could exert to get that done any faster.
Okay, thank you. Currently, the movement of goods and commerce is very important. So is there anybody, maybe Ms. Homendy or others, a look at maybe providing a waiver for trucker hours? Because they're going to face 2 or 3 hours of delays. Is there a way that truckers' hours can have flexibility for time of duty on that, as well as the ability to use the tunnels there for ordinarily what trucks wouldn't be allowed to do?
Thanks, sir. That would actually be under U.S. Department of Transportation and FMCSA working with the state. They can make waiver requests for truck weight, and also I'm not sure on the trucker hours. I'll be happy to get back to you for the service hours, but certainly.
Yeah, please look into that. If locals are saying that would be helpful in order to complete, you wouldn't want to run out by 2 hours or something with the initial delay would be. But also, is there an issue of the tunnel being available to all types of trucking? In other words, restrictions on certain types of trucking that could be helpful. Could you have a waiver on maybe hazardous materials having a certain time of day that they could access it, for example, that maybe they can't otherwise? Just looking for ways for flexibility. That's what I'd be asking. Would those be possible thoughts, do you think?
The gentleman's time has expired.
Okay, thank you. Can he answer that?
Yeah, quickly.
Thank you.
Happy to follow up with your office, sir, on those questions.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and I recognize Ms. Sykes for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson for convening this full committee hearing today. And to our witnesses, thank you for your testimony and for working diligently to respond to the tragedy that struck the Francis Scott Key Bridge in March. And I join my colleagues in expressing my sympathy to the families who lost loved ones and lives, as well as the greater Baltimore and Maryland community. Coming from Ohio, this is really important. We have the nation's second highest number of bridges, and this is a very important conversation for us. And even just last week, we presented 2 checks to our county engineer and county executive for nearly $10 million to replace a decommissioned over 70-year-old bridge that is identified as critical infrastructure. So bridge security and safety is very important to us in Ohio's 13th district and across the state of Ohio. But I want to highlight something different. Less than 2 months after this disaster struck in Maryland, the majority on this committee was able to organize and hold a very timely and necessary hearing on the incident. And this hearing and the witnesses today are a perfect example of federal government fulfilling its role to support state and local efforts from disasters with federal dollars and resources when they're needed most. This partnership between governing bodies is what I hoped to see more of when I was elected to Congress 2 years ago. So you all can understand my disappointment when, in the over a year since the train derailment devastated the community of East Palestine and its way of life, the majority on this community has not shown the same sense of urgency and has yet to notice a hearing to discuss the state of rail safety in Ohio. What about the people of Ohio and East Palestine who have been begging us? This question is to the majority, who have been begging us to do something on rail safety. And even on the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, Subcommittee on Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials, the subcommittee would not hold a hearing to discuss the Norfolk Southern train derailment or the broader issue of rail safety, leaving Democrats to host a rail safety roundtable without members of the majority present. And while I don't represent East Palestine geographically, I am the only Ohioan on this committee, and East Palestine does not currently have a member of the United States House of Representatives serving in Congress. So I have no problem speaking up for my neighbors to the east of me. And since the derailment in East Palestine, 2 additional trains have derailed in Ohio alone and many others across the country. And the communities, local and state, are still burdened with contaminated local waterways and some airways across the nation. Even more recently, on March 2nd of this year, 3 trains crashed and derailed in eastern Pennsylvania, leaving at least 7 crew members injured, with the estimated damages to the equipment and track to be about $2.5 million. Emergency personnel responding to the scene found diesel fuel had spilled from one of the train cars, but contaminant booms were deployed to clean up the spill before the situation worsened. It was by luck that a derailment of those 3 trains was not worse or anything like we saw in eastern Ohio. It is very clear that the issue of train derailments is not going away, and turning a blind eye to the issue is clearly not the path that Congress or this committee should take. Americans across the political spectrum, including the former president, the Biden-Harris administration, all agree. We must pass common sense rail safety legislation to prevent future train derailments and keep our community safe. I am proud that Ohio Democrats and Republicans came together to introduce the Bipartisan Rail Act last year, and now it is time for the House Republican majority to pass the Rail Act to protect Ohioans and communities across the country. The Rail Act would implement effective measures to keep our communities safe, hold railroad corporations accountable, and ensure that no American living close to our 140,000 miles of railroad track has to worry about the threat of a toxic train derailment in their backyard. Finally, I would like to take a moment to recognize the administration, our state and local partners in the state of Ohio, and public servants who are continuously uplifting East Palestine, even though this committee and the United States House of Representatives has turned a blind eye and turned their back to the people of Ohio. And I would also like to take a moment to recognize Ms. Homendy and thank her and the rest of the National Transportation Safety Board for their investigation into the cause of the Norfolk Southern train derailment and their work in investigating other accidents across the country with no doubt fewer people than you need. You have continued to fill in the gap where Congress have refused to act, holding hearings and town halls with residents in East Palestine, providing preliminary information that we could act upon, and a sense that people in the administration, in the federal government, do care about them, even if this committee and this Congress has refused to. I look forward to reviewing the board's findings and hopefully considering their recommendations as we look to rail safety in America. And thank you again for filling in the gaps where this committee has failed the people of East Palestine. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and I recognize Mr. Burleson for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Homendy. It was just mentioned about the derailment in East Palestine, and we've had some other derailments that have made the news. But overall, would it not be accurate to say that trains and that ultimately they're more safe? It's probably the safest mode of transportation for goods and services, goods to be transported?
For transportation, over 40,000 people are dying on our nation's roads. So as far as transporting goods and people, rail is incredibly safe. It doesn't mean that a tragedy doesn't occur, and that's where we come in and investigate.
Okay, so I think it would be dangerous if we started trying to steer activity more, away from rail because of these events. How many people died?
I'd like more things to go on rail.
Right. How many people died in East Palestine?
No one died in East Palestine.
I think it's important to note that while it might have been an environmental hazard, I think it's important to recognize the actual numbers. Mr. Barrett, or is it Barat? Or Bott, sorry. Mr. Bott. My question has to do with the Francis Scott Key Bridge, which has been a subject for this entire hearing. As I understand, there's about 15,000 jobs that are dependent upon on the port, and another 140,000 that are linked to the port. Many of the individuals are worried that they could lose their jobs because of no longer having access because of the collapse of the bridge. How long will it take to construct the new bridge?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. And yes, the port, and I think that's part of the critical efforts of the Army Corps and the Coast Guard to get that port reopened so that those jobs can resume. I think the bridge itself, once the port reopens, is on a 2028 schedule. Right now is the preliminary estimate to get that bridge back open.
So 4-year estimate. That what about the cost for the bridge?
So right now, the way that the RFP is being structured, it will be a progressive design build. So you go in and you say, this is the structure that we need to build, and then the benefits of progressive design build is they can bring in different elements. So that's why the cost and the schedule will update as the different elements come in. But right now it's estimated $1.7 to $1.9 billion.
Have there been any environmental concerns or any other issues that we might be able to look to sign any waivers that might expedite the construction of the bridge?
Yeah, so on the environmental side and through NEPA, that's why we're likely going to get to a categorical exclusion, because we're putting a bridge back where one existed relatively within the same footprint. We'll work with our permitting agencies to make sure that we're not missing anything, but that is our plan.
And you served as the head of transportation for the state of Colorado prior to this role, is that correct?
And Delaware.
Okay. And so in that role, what is your experience? I know we just had a new rule or executive order that was put in place under this administration that requires project labor agreements for anything. I think it's above $35 million. Is that the cost?
I would have to come back on the exact numbers.
So in your experience on both the state level and the federal level, do requiring project labor agreements improve the timeline of projects?
Sir, I would need to come back to you with specific examples on the timeline and the.
What about the costs?
Again, sir, I don't want to speculate. I want to come back with the specific data.
And I'm not trying to press on you. We had a great conversation before, but surely you have enough years of experience to understand the distinction and the difference between the costs of a project, whether or not a project labor agreement is required.
Yeah, with the one project I would think about, and it wasn't a PLA that was required, but we did do what I would call the first sort of local hiring preference in Denver when we replaced the I-70 viaduct. And the goal is, and I think it's similar to where the administration is here, is trying to create good paying jobs and create a workforce for the future and ensure that we're building the nation's infrastructure and building out great jobs.
But if the taxpayer were going to get more bang for their buck, if they're going to get more bridges, more roads, it would be without a project labor agreement.
Again, sir, I want to come back to you with the specific data on that.
I think the answer is yes. Thank you. My time has expired.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and I recognize Mr. Menendez for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just quickly following up, I had the opportunity to visit the Portal North Bridge, which runs through New Jersey, a critically important part of the Gateway program. To mark the 50% completion of the project, it's largely being built by labor. It's on time and on budget. So I thank my friends in labor for the incredible work that they do to continue to develop and build our critical infrastructure. I want to thank all of our witnesses today for their testimony and their ongoing work regarding the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse. I want to join my colleagues in recognizing the 6 workers who lost their lives during this tragic accident, immigrants who are making not just our infrastructure stronger, but our nation stronger. My thoughts are with their families and the communities that they were a part of. New Jersey's 8th Congressional District is home to the largest port on the East Coast. Following the collapse of the Key Bridge, the Port of New York and New Jersey was ready to accommodate additional vessels to ensure our supply chain remained intact. This is thanks in large part to the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, their dedicated teams, the operators of our ports, and the incredible men and women of ILA who keep our region moving. Administrator Bhatt, your testimony notes that the Federal Highway Administration will work to ensure that the new bridge is built to current design standards. Can you describe how design standards have changed since the Key Bridge was built in 1977 and the challenges posed by increasingly large vessels calling at our ports?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I think if you look at the bridge, it was a truss bridge, and they're very strong and made of steel, and that was the prevailing design at that time. When you look at many of the truss bridges that are being replaced today, they're being replaced by cable stay bridges for the most part. There's a lot of advantages from cost, strength. You can precast the concrete sections, bring them into place, and so I think that's probably the likely design that will come forward. With regard to design standards, obviously, there's vertical load and lateral load that we have to account for. And then I think specifically what the Francis Scott Key Bridge has brought forward and what we're going to be working very closely with Chair Homendy and I echo her call to any bridge owner to begin examining their bridges right now is what is the appropriate level of protection that we need to design so that we don't have another similar situation.
And taking into consideration the size of the vessels that are coming through our ports and through our channels, given that they've increased in size over definitely since 1977. That would be part of the analysis, is that correct?
Absolutely, sir, yes.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The Port Infrastructure Development Program provides grants to support efforts to improve port and related infrastructure and meet our supply chain needs. Between 2019 and 2023, this program received $9 billion in applications, but only received $2.25 billion in appropriations over 5 years in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Mr. Bhatt, should we be doing more to invest in landside infrastructure?
Thank you, Representative. I've been actually at a bunch of ports just this week. I served on the port board in Wilmington, Delaware, and I would say there is a critical need for infrastructure everywhere, including for the one that you mentioned.
And how would increased appropriations to the Port Infrastructure Development Program potentially help prevent future tragedies?
Sure, I'd want to consult with the folks at MARAD to get you a specific answer to that question.
Okay, fair enough. To Chair Homendy, I understand that you're limited today in what you can share regarding this particular incident, but can you touch on what features may be implemented on both new and existing bridges to better protect them from potential impacts like what we saw in Baltimore?
Yeah, this is what we're looking at as part of our investigation. We're working with Maryland to evaluate their other bridges, and then we're looking at other areas in the United States where bridge owners have improved bridge infrastructure after a vessel strike, including any sort of fender systems, pier protection, dolphins. That's exactly what we're looking at. We don't have recommendations today on that. But again, I would stress that states and bridge owners should be evaluating, especially with older bridges, what is going through as far as in their navigable waterways now, what is the risk, and how should they address that?
And do you, quickly follow up, do you anticipate or have a sense of timing of when those recommendations might be made available, just given sort of the timely importance of making sure that the existing infrastructure throughout the country is up to date?
So we often issue urgent safety recommendations, and we may, in this case, decide to issue an urgent safety recommendation at any time, including before we issue a final report. We are aiming for 18 months on a final report, but again, that we may have updates to the investigation that we release, and we may issue urgent safety recommendations as well.
I think this might make sense in this instance to ensure that people feel secure when they're crossing any types of these bridges. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and I recognize Mr. Ezel for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. Appreciate all of you and your hard work and dedication. Vice Admiral, we have a town in my county named after you, but we pronounce it a little different there in South Mississippi. So Goche is the way we say it, but we'll just leave that to us. So anyway, as you know, one of the few remaining United States shipbuilders is in my county district, Huntington Ingalls. And what can we do, what can be done to encourage the greater use of United States flagged vessels to ensure that ships coming through our ports are held to the highest mechanical standards?
Yeah, thanks, Congressman. I think I might be named after somebody who's grew up in that town. But the Coast Guard works very hard to assure that with the number of foreign flag vessels that call in U.S. ports every single day, that we maintain an equivalent level of safety. We do this through the International Maritime Organization. Actually, they're meeting this week on a number of issues of emerging technologies. So we've done things like worked on the standards of training, watchkeeping, and certification for all mariners, U.S. and international. We want to do this in a way, sir, that doesn't disadvantage our U.S. mariners so we can have the equivalent levels that global shipping and global crews on vessels have to adhere to.
Thank you. Additionally, do you think this incident could be a cause for recommending harbor tugs escort large ships through larger channels? And if so, do you think this incident could have been avoided?
It may be, but we don't know yet. It's too early in the investigation to understand whether tugs would or would not have helped in this circumstance. Although what I will say is that there are some areas in some ports around the U.S. that have tug escort requirements for a variety of reasons, and they're all different. For example, under the Verrazano Bridge. For example, in the state of California, for tank vessels entering into the San Francisco Bay area. Those determinations are typically made by harbor safety committees with all stakeholders getting together to understand the totality of risk, not just the Coast Guard, and then agreeing on what tug requirements might be particular to that area of risk.
Very good. Administrator Bhatt, I noticed in DOT FY 2025 appropriations budget request that there were no additional funds provided beyond the annual $100 million authorization in the Emergency Relief Fund. Given the backlog of requests and unmet needs, especially in Mississippi, how do you anticipate fulfilling the request for all highway projects and this bridge?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. I know that the OMB director was part of a tour of the site a few weeks ago. I don't want to get ahead of the administration, but I believe that, generally speaking, the ER backlog has been topped up through supplementals historically, and I believe that may be part of the discussion.
Thank you. Continuing with you, along with ensuring the process moves along quickly, how do you plan to coordinate with the state of Maryland and other stakeholders to ensure that proper funds are obligated quickly?
Thank you, Congressman. It is absolutely top of mind, and having worked in the private sector, I know that projects delivered on time and on budget are always our target, and so we are moving with great speed, working in close coordination with them to make sure that they're hitting all of the timelines, and they've set an aggressive schedule as well.
Very good. Chair Homendy, it's been reported the actions taken by the vessel and the state police who took swift action to minimize the casualties. In the future, how can we better improve the communication between vessels, people on the bridge, and emergency responders?
Well, that is part of our investigation, and we'll look at that. It was key. When the pilots reached out to the dispatchers and the dispatchers called MDTA police, it was a very quick notification to shut down operations on the bridge, and everyone just involved in that was a heroic effort, certainly. So we will look at that as part of our investigation to determine what should be the standard going forward.
Thank you, and thank you all again for being here today. And Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields, and I recognize Mr. Auchincloss for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Some of my colleagues today have indicated their support for the concept of federal monies being repaid through tolling on the bridge. I would associate myself with that concept and with interest in that concept. I think in general, tolling on critical infrastructure is an appropriate way to fund it in the long run, and I would encourage the relevant agencies in Congress to consider that, not just for this bridge, but for all bridges going forward as we think about how to responsibly fund critical infrastructure and address the backlog. Vice Admiral, I appreciate your testimony, and I appreciate also the unified response in Baltimore that you have been part of. And I'm concerned, though, about the strain on the Coast Guard and whether that is going to further exacerbate the service's challenges in operating with a budget and workforce deficit. Since the surge in Baltimore wasn't anticipated, there will be downstream effects on other Coast Guard missions and stations. If the service does not receive additional resources from Congress, what are the likely short and long-term consequences for operations in a place like Massachusetts?
Congressman, as you know, we surge resources to the top priorities at the moment, whether that be a bridge collapse or a hurricane response or a search and rescue case. But to your point, more often we do that and with insufficient budget to make sure that we can do things like recapitalize our assets and to close this urgent workforce gap that we have in enlisted ranks our ability to do that is going to be eroded over time.
So articulate the trade-offs that we might have to make. What should Congress understand about trade-offs that have to happen if you're not resourced appropriately?
So take, for example, this near 10% enlisted workforce shortfall. If we do not have the resourcing or the recruiting and retention capability within the Coast Guard in order to get that back up to normal, then we're going to have to continue on doing the sorts of things that we've done, like not completely staffing certain stations around the country where there might be some redundancies. We might not.
And then what does that mean for your mission set? So can you not do, for example, law enforcement for recreational boating? Can you not do illegal fisheries law enforcement? Like, what are some of the missions that might get eroded if you don't have the resourcing?
That's right. We're going to have to make tough choices to deliberately back off of doing certain things that we would normally do, like some recreational boating boardings, like some fisheries law enforcement boardings, like some lower priority aids to navigation around the country.
Good. I think it's important to be specific about the trade-offs because I want Congress to understand that you can't get something for nothing, and we have to fund the Coast Guard's vital 11 missions. I know you're also conducting an Atlantic Coast port access route study, one of the goals of which is to reduce the risk of marine casualties and increase the efficiency of vessel traffic on the Atlantic coast. How is the Coast Guard reevaluating this study in light of the Baltimore accident, and how should ports evaluate potential risks to their infrastructure going forward?
I think Baltimore is a sober reminder of the consequences when you have large vessels and then you have a mishap and then you have some critical infrastructure and then we have the results that we've seen. What we're doing in terms of the port access route studies is exactly to prevent those sorts of circumstances. As we know that there will be more fixed objects, i.e. wind turbines, wind farms offshore, starting in New England and then working down to other parts of the country, we need to have assurances that there are shipping lanes that will be free from the construction of offshore wind farms so that maritime transportation can continue at low risk to collisions and elisions.
I appreciate it, and I'll yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and I recognize Mr. Williams for 5 minutes for questions, and apologize for skipping you earlier. Sorry.
It's all right. Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you all for being here and for your expert testimony. I've read through the accident report, such as it is, and would like to follow up on some details of that, just to try to understand it. And maybe, Madam Chairwoman, start with you. Do we know, I'm sure we do, are we looking at the manufacturers of HR1, LR1 breakers, the tie bus, the transformer, the control system, you know, all of those things that appear in the switchboard cabinet, you know, in your report? You have the inspector that's taping those shut. Have we identified the manufacturer of all of those components, including the sub-assemblies and the things that are inside?
Yes, so we are currently working with Hyundai, who manufactured many of the components, and they are a party to our investigation and have come to Baltimore to work with us to do testing on board the vessel, and our engineers are back on board the vessel today.
So I understand that Hyundai would assemble the control system, the panel, if you will, like a panel shop would. But the individual components inside, whether that's a PLC or a SCADA system or sensors, actuators, whatever those things are we looking all the way down into the components, the whole supply chain that made up all those components?
We are.
And is there, when you represent, you know, the transformer, the ICMS, the integrated control and monitoring system, you're saying all of that comes from Hyundai?
Not every single feature or sensor comes from Hyundai, but if we are looking at any sensors or pumps or any other component on the vessel, then we will work with whoever that manufacturer is.
Is there an investigation into cybersecurity that's being evaluated for all these components?
Well, currently, we have no evidence of this time to suggest that this was a cybersecurity threat. It has been stated at Unified Command that the Coast Guard and FBI also did not believe this was a cybersecurity issue. We have a memorandum of understanding with the FBI that if there is any evidence of that, we have to turn this over immediately to them.
Is there a criminal investigation going on at all?
I am aware that there is some work being done by the Department of Justice, but that's not within the NTSB's purview.
So in a cybersecurity or a cyber attack, there's a lot of concern about embedded systems embedded into what's called a real-time operating system, or inside the control logic, or inside the control elements there. That would require an enormous amount of sophisticated forensics to evaluate, and I would think, which would require dismantling that whole switchboard and doing a component-by-component search. Is that kind of investigation underway?
Our investigators have over 400 years of experience who are investigating this accident itself, and they go where the evidence takes them. As far as anything the Department of Justice or FBI is doing, that is not something I can speak to.
Well, in terms of 400 years of experience, there's probably just the last 5 that are relevant in terms of cybersecurity, particularly in industrial controls.
Right. My point, though, is they have significant expertise on marine
I understand
safety.
your point, and I have significant expertise as well. And so, the point of my question is, as we've seen in embedded systems and in very integrated components from a wide variety of vendors, that understanding the entire supply chain, understanding and evaluating things all the way down to the operating system, or even the BIOS and other features deep in the systems is critically important. As I read through the accident report, it's not clear to me that anybody knows why those breakers tripped, why the transformer tripped offline, what dumped the bus, and it seems like until we know the origin of the actual accident, that all of these things should be taken as likely or at least possible. Would you agree?
Yeah, this is a preliminary report, and what we released yesterday was preliminary. We are still conducting our investigation, and we go where the evidence takes us.
And that includes a forensics on the actual components that are there, which would require significant disassembly and evaluation, in my opinion.
We will follow the evidence, and anything security-wise, if we find anything, we will turn it over immediately to the criminal authorities.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questioning. You've all been sitting here for a long time. You've been pretty thoroughly questioned. I just want to wrap up with, is there anything any of you want to highlight for your respective agencies that would be helpful to this committee that you haven't already covered? I'll start with Vice Admiral Gautier, and we'll move down the line.
Congresswoman, factual statement, I think that this has been pretty thoroughly questioned. In terms of I've been asked several questions in terms about Coast Guard resourcing, and I think it bears repeating from our perspective is we're incredibly proud of the folks in the field who have responded. They have done an amazing job with their counterparts to do this. We cannot guarantee over time that the Coast Guard is going to be able to perform at that level, whether that be a search and rescue case or a patrol in Asia or patrolling for the potential for mass migration in the Caribbean without substantial support and enduring support from Congress and appropriation side in terms of recapitalizing our aging assets, in improving our procurement, construction, and improvement support from Congress, the things that help the people in terms of training that leads us to successful operations like this. So I appreciate the opportunity to convey that to you.
Major General Graham.
And thank you for that question and the opportunity to be here today. Probably 2 points I'd just like to wrap up with. We talked a lot about safety of the general public. I just want to commend the teams on site, from the Coast Guard to the port to the various agencies. Knock on wood right now, it's been an amazingly safe operation. It was probably some of the riskiest diving operations you could have. Tethered divers going down, water you certainly can't see to the end of your fingers with. We were guiding them by sonar, really. Steel sticking out, and they did it amazingly safely. Job's not over yet, and our commitment is to continue that safety record until the federal channel is completely cleared. There was a lot of discussion on the resiliency of infrastructure. About 3 weeks after the Dali hit the bridge, some barges broke away on the Ohio River near Pittsburgh, and they bounced off of 2 of the locks and dams that the Corps runs on the upper reaches of the Ohio River. And the infrastructure withstood those strikes because it was designed to withstand those strikes. Right now, we're trying to stretch taxpayers' dollars as far as we can, and we're looking at some of the gates on those structures and to see if we can go from steel to fiber-reinforced polymers. And one of the things we're taking a look at is to see, well, if we do build them from fiber-reinforced polymer, will they withstand barge strikes and whatnot as well as the steel does? And so all that is to make a shameless plug for research and development funding that's we agencies need to continue to advance the state of engineering. Thank you.
Thank you. Shameless plug noted. Mr. Bhatt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would end where I started, which is, I've been around a number of these sort of bridge disasters, and just the confidence I feel that this response, whether it's through the Unified Command or the Army Corps or the Coast Guard, Federal Highways, all the various parts of USDOT, I feel like it's just been such a exemplary response and a message to send the American people that when disaster strikes, the government is there working in close coordination with the private sector. I appreciate a lot of the questions from the majority around the funding of the bridge. I appreciate their concern for fully funding it, open to looking at the different methodologies that they brought forward. I would just highlight from a federal highway perspective that there is $3.7 billion, including the bridge, of unmet need across the country in red states and blue states, and the ER program, as it's designated, we want to follow the law, and it doesn't really matter the color of the state. We're going to show up, and we want to make sure that the funding is available for ER programs across the country.
Thank you. Ms. Homendy?
Thank you. First of all, let me thank this committee. On a bipartisan basis, you led the effort to reauthorize the NTSB as part of FAA reauthorization. So thank you very much for that. You also led the way on fully funding the NTSB along with House appropriators for our request for FY24. We hope you will do the same for FY25. But our FY24 funding came in a little bit lower. Again, we fully appreciate it because it is higher than we receive now. But if you just look at this investigation, we have 12 people in our Office of Marine Safety. They need an additional 5. That doesn't include all the other modes within the NTSB that need people, and the supporting offices, as well as dealing with unfunded mandates, lab equipment, and training needs. So the $10.7 million that we got in an increase in FY24 actually translated into a little over 5 because we had to take on a 5.2% pay raise. Well deserved, but we have to think about the impact on the smaller agencies there. And so we have about 5, and we have to figure out, okay, what 11 positions out of the hundreds can we fund? So for the Office of Marine Safety itself, 12 people on their staff, half of which are dedicated to this particular accident, and they have over 60 other cases. And what happens is those get pushed a little bit so they could focus on the next major one. So any support you can provide for FY25 is really appreciated.
Thank you. One more really quick question. Major General Graham, does the Corps have an updated timeline for when the full federal navigation channel will open?
Our commitment is to have it fully open by the end of this month, sooner if possible.
Okay, thank you. I'm way over my time, but they gave me the gavel, so nobody's stopping me. Thank you. I yield back. Are there any further questions from any members of the committee who've not been recognized? Seeing none, that concludes our hearing for today. I would like to thank each of the witnesses for your testimony, and the committee stands adjourned.